Eventually, the month-long recuperation period came to an end. Zorian spent the last few hours of that restart with Kiriel, attending Siren's own celebration of the summer festival. Kiriel was very happy with him, because apparently she was never allowed to wander around or stay up so late during the previous festivals. He didn't really reciprocate her excitement. To be honest, Siren's summer festival was the same as it was every year, incredibly dull. He found himself almost wishing for Abasan invaders to make an appearance, just to liven the place up a bit. Okay, no. No, he didn't. The whole thing was still very boring, that's what he meant. Regardless, with the beginning of the new restart, initiated by the familiar feeling of Kiriel jumping on top of him to wake him up, he was ready to once again tackle the problem of contacting the Arania and getting them to teach him mind magic. It didn't work all too well last time, but he had a whole month to consider what went wrong and how to fix it, and he was willing to give it another go. Though not immediately, of course teleporting to the nearest Iranian web right from the start would be stupid. He had no intention of getting anywhere near one until he had already tested some tactics and equipped himself accordingly. Consequently, he started the restart in the same way he had started most of the previous ones, by going to Nyazov Dveri. He did two things before anything else after entering the town. First, he descended into the local dungeon to pick up all the mana crystals he knew the location of, though he didn't sell a single one in the Delver village, or even the town above, so hopefully there would be no uproar and spying attempts on him this time around. Secondly, he saved both Alanik and Lukav from the assassins, even though he had no intention of pursuing lessons from Alanik in this restart. One of his reasons was purely emotional. Both men had helped him a lot, and it felt wrong to let them die when he was already there, capable of preventing their deaths, even if it was meaningless in the long term. But the other reason was that saving them gave him some relatively non-threatening combat practice. He knew he could defeat the undead boars trying to ambush Lukav and the attack party assaulting Alanik's temple without dying, but they were still life and death battles that he had to take seriously. One of these days, when he finally got some mind magic expertise from the Arania, he was going to capture the two mages involved in the assault on Alanik's temple and trawl through their memories to see if they knew anything important. Maybe some of the gunmen too. But he was getting ahead of himself. No counting his chickens before they hatch. Better worry about actually learning said mind magic before thinking about what he would do once he had it. The first and most obvious problem he had to tackle was what to do if things went wrong again. No matter what precautions he decided to take, there was always a possibility he would bite off more than he could chew or end up caught off guard. Technically, he had his suicide rings for that, but there was one thing that struck him about his altercation with the sword divers: how slow he had been about activating them. He should have blown himself up the moment it became obvious that the situation had become hopeless, instead of waiting for the last possible moment like he had. He could think up a lot of excuses for himself, but at the end it all came down to one simple fact: he didn't want to die. He had a powerful survival instinct, and it was not easy for him to consciously kill himself even if he knew, on an intellectual level, that it wouldn't be permanent. Thus, he had waited until he was absolutely sure he wasn't getting out of that situation alive and intact, and it had almost cost him everything. All things considered, Zorian didn't want to become jaded, accustomed to dying and suicide. That seemed a bad attitude to have, especially once he left the time loop. That left two main ways he could see to deal with the problem. One was to set up a bunch of contingencies into his suicide rings, allowing them to activate automatically in certain cases. Another was to have more options to choose from when faced with disaster, something other than fight to the death or kill yourself. A retreat option. Contingencies sounded like a good idea, and Zorian even had some experience making them thanks to his studying of warding, a discipline that made heavy use of contingencies to determine when it should activate particular defenses. Unfortunately, most warding schemes used relatively easy-to-define triggers such as, a human touches the object or, a living being not keyed into the wards enters the area, defining a trigger for a contingency that would kill him should his mind be tampered with but wouldn't activate the moment he engaged in telepathic communication of any sort or hit his head or became dizzy, or a million other things which were beyond him at the moment. Even if he could make such a thing, he would still have to exhaustively test it to make sure it was reliable by working with a friendly Arania. Which, kind of made it useless for his current needs. So he cheated. Instead of creating a nuanced, sophisticated contingency, he made the metaphorical equivalent of a sledgehammer. Specifically, he made a contingency that would kill him the moment he lost consciousness or suffered a sufficiently strong headache, but only if he turned it on. It would normally stay dormant, to cut down on unwanted activations, but he could activate it on a moment's notice if he found himself in a dangerous situation. He wasn't terribly happy with that solution, but it would do for now. He just had to remember to turn it off once the danger had passed, lest he explode the next time he went to sleep. That would be so very embarrassing. That being done, he turned his attention to the retreat option. He had considered everything from talking to Lucav about transforming into a rock worm or some other tunneling creature, alteration spells that would allow him to create his own paths and sanctuaries underground, phasing magic, haste spells, and more. But ultimately, his mind kept going back to teleportation. It was the ultimate form of mobility magic, and everything else was just a poor substitute. If he could somehow bypass dungeon interference to teleport away, he could simply avoid ambushes like the ones the sword divers had used against him instead of resorting to suicide in order to evade capture. Fortunately, during the month-long recuperation, Zorian had come up with an idea of how he could sidestep his current limitation as far as teleportation was concerned. Which was why, before descending into the dungeon, he turned one of the large stones he found on the outskirts of Nyazov Dveri into a recall anchor. The recall spell was outright made specifically for quick retreats, and the link forged between the caster and the anchor ensured they could teleport out even from areas warded against teleportation. Well, so long as the wards were basic ones, since those protections simply disrupted the targeting part of the teleport rather than inhibiting dimensional warping as such. Consequently, Zorian had a feeling the spell would work to yank him back to the anchor, even through the dungeon interference. He was right sort of. He had found that past a certain depth, the strain on the link became too much and it snapped. Before that happened, however, the spell worked flawlessly, allowing Zorian to quickly teleport away to the surface. The depth past which it ceased to work was too shallow for his liking, but he was confident he could strengthen the link. Over the next couple of days, he worked to combine several marking spells and his knowledge of spell formula in order to create a stronger anchor for the recall spell, one that would allow it to power through any amount of rock and dungeon interference. He was largely successful in this, though the anchor object had to be pretty large to contain the final spell formula he designed. No matter, there was no need to make the anchor particularly portable for what he had in mind. Satisfied that both of his projects bore fruit, Zorian spent the rest of the week creating various portable traps and magic items, including a more combat-worthy version of his wooden golem. Golems, having no minds, were almost entirely immune to Iranian mind magic, and Zorian intended to bring one with him under the explanation that it was his helper and luggage carrier. Partially true, since the golem he'd made wasn't exactly the mobile wardstone and murder statue that professional war golems were, but in the end it was still a painfully obvious bodyguard construct, and Zorian fully expected the Arania to recognize it as such. Having such a guardian trailing behind him was bound to make even the most opportunistic Arania think twice about going after him. Or at least he hoped so. He also hoped they wouldn't feel too threatened by the construct, since they might simply refuse to talk to him at all if it made them too nervous around him. Well, no matter. He would risk it. Gathering all of his equipment, he teleported himself and his golem to the one Iranian colony that had been friendly to him the last time around. It was time to pay the illustrious gem collectors a visit. The last time Zorian had visited the Iranian web that called itself Illustrious Gem Collectors, he found a colony that specialized in harvesting various precious stones that were abundant in their local underworld and traded them to the nearby human village in exchange for various human-produced goods. They were miners, essentially. They informed him straight away that they had agreed not to trade with any humans except the ones at the village, but gave him the locations of 5 other webs that might be more willing to help him. Since his main goal had been to locate as many Iranian webs as possible and sound them out, Zorian had accepted this explanation at face value and moved on. However, after thinking about it for a while, he realized he had been kind of stupid. Just because they couldn't trade with him didn't mean they couldn't receive gifts. He should have given them one. Aside from the fact they may have been even more helpful if he had done so, there was also a chance they immediately alerted the webs they sent him to about his coming. In which case he definitely wanted them to put in a good word for him, which would be far more likely if he were handing out gifts to every group he visited. Hell, he even had a perfect gift for them. Although he cashed in on a lot of the crystallized mana he found in Nyazov Dveri's local underworld, he left a fair amount for his own tinkering and for situations like this. He was pretty sure the illustrious gem collectors would have no problems accepting a gift of crystallized mana, since they traded similar items to the village all the time, and it would not be in the least bit suspicious of them to have a couple of mana crystals in their possession. Zorian entered the tunnels that held the gem collectors' colony and contacted the nearest sentry in the manner shown to him by the web's matriarch during his last visit. If the web found it in any way unusual that a human knew how to properly greet them and ask for audience, they never mentioned it. Instead, he was soon presented with the web's matriarch, she who eats fire and sees gold, and her escort of 10 other Arania. 2 more guards than the last time. Apparently having his golem trail after him did have an effect. Still, while the matriarch was noticeably more nervous around him this time, she did not act outraged at his addition, and she gave him essentially the same speech she had the last time around. They were honored by the visit, but they had prior commitments and agreements and couldn't deal with him, so here's a bunch of other webs he could pester for help instead. Only this time they gave him 8 names instead of 5. Aside from the Rose Labyrinth Dwellers, Yellow Cavern Guardians, Filigree Sages, River Navigators and Luminous Advocates that he'd already known about, she also gave him the location of the Talisman Bearers, Ghost Serpent Acolytes and Silent Doorway Adepts. Strange. Why the extra information this time around? Is there something special about those last 3 webs? He asked. Ah, so you have heard of them then, the matriarch said, making her own conclusions about his question. Yes, they are a bit shady in their dealings with others, human and Arania alike. I wouldn't normally send a young mage like you to webs like theirs, but you seem like someone who can take care of himself. She gave his golem a significant look. He's just my luggage carrier, Zorian said. You have done more than I could have possibly hoped for, honored matriarch, Zorian answered honestly. He beckoned the golem to come closer and pulled out a box from the backpack it was carrying, pointedly ignoring the wave of tension that rippled throughout the assembled Arania at the action. He then opened the box, revealing several pieces of crystallized mana, and placed it in front of the matriarch. Please, he said. Take this as a small token of my appreciation for your help. The matriarch stared at the box without a word for several seconds before becoming agitated. No, wait, she was just trying to mimic shaking her head with her entire body. I cannot accept this, she protested. Zorian frowned. Surely the village leadership isn't so insistent about your trade agreement as to keep you from accepting gifts. It is not that. Your gift it is simply too generous, the matriarch said. It's too much. I respectfully disagree, said Zorian firmly. You were amicable and honest with me, and you told me where to go even if you could not help me yourself. You've most likely saved me months of searching by telling me where I can find more webs. I feel this is the least I can do for wasting your time with this meeting. The matriarch remained silent after that. After a while, Zorian figured she was not going to say anything and that this was effectively the end of their meeting. In any case, I suppose it's time for me to leave, Zorian said. Until we meet a dash. Wait, the matriarch said, interrupting his farewell. One of the webs I told you about. The Luminous Advocates. Yes? Asked Zorian curiously. They are a web dedicated to honing our psychic abilities as much as possible, even by Iranian standards. Among other things, that means they are intensely interested in studying rare cases, such as Arania with unique talents or human psychics. They will want to work with you every bit as much as you want to work with them. Always keep that in mind, because they're liable to pretend otherwise when you deal with them. I see, Zorian responded. That is a very useful thing to know about. I thank you for your advice, wise matriarch. Oh, there is no need to flatter me, she said. I'm just helping a good, generous soul get forward in life. Besides, the luminous advocates are snotty and arrogant, always looking down on us as mere minors and thinking their mastery of the mind arts makes them so much better than everyone else. In my opinion, they deserve to be taken down a bit. But never mind that, I've just realized I've been a terrible host. If you would be willing to follow me deeper into the tunnels, I would love to give you a brief tour of our humble home. We can talk some more while we walk. Zorian agreed, but quietly turned on the suicide contingencies before following after her. Just in case. Despite Zorian's concerns, the brief tour of the place offered by the matriarch turned out to be just that. There was no sudden ambush or sinister reveals, just a stroll through the tunnels with some running commentary. Zorian could tell he was only being shown the less interesting, outer parts of the settlement, but the tour was really more of an excuse to have a conversation and exchange some information, so he didn't mention it. The matriarch gave him a little more information about the other webs. The Rose Labyrinth dwellers were somewhat unique in the sense that they never visited the surface. Most Urania webs lived underground but were heavily dependent on the surface for their survival. Not so for the Rose Labyrinth dwellers, they were only active underground, and were rather mysterious even to other Urania. The matriarch didn't know how they would feel about teaching him, but she seemed sure they wouldn't attack. The Yellow Cavern Guardians had apparently found one of the rare underground fungal forests and made it their home. They were fiercely protective of their home, knowing just how tempting a target it was for just about anyone, but the matriarch felt they were worth the visit. The Filigree sages specialized in webcraft, which was basically the Urania equivalent of spell formulas. Instead of carving glyphs onto items, they anchored their spells into web constructs for some reason. Zorian didn't understand why they would do that, since web constructs were bound to be far more fragile than glyphs carved into stone and metals, but it seemed to be a thing among the Urania. It was probably a convenience thing. Uranian limbs weren't exactly made for carving and chiseling things, so they probably had to use alteration magic any time they wanted to do such things. Easier to just spin some webs. The river navigators made their homes on the banks of an underground river, and had mastered the skill of making boats and using them to travel down its length and back. This allowed them to range a lot further than most Urania could manage, and thus gather more resources. They were very active in trading with humans, but mostly for material possessions rather than psychic instruction. Finally, there were the Luminous Advocates. Their territory had little in the way of natural resources, so they mostly traded their mind magic expertise to other Uranian webs instead of dealing with humans much, but that was due to lack of means rather than wants. The matriarch insisted that the Luminous Advocates were clearly jealous of the illustrious gem collector's wealth, and otherwise made some snide comments about their character and even sexual potency. She did admit, albeit grudgingly, that they were his best bet if approached correctly. Zorian was somewhat surprised how relatively advanced the Urania in the local region were with regards to their crafting abilities. The Sciorian web mostly traded with the surface for all their crafting needs and didn't produce anything except silk and processed monster parts. It reminded him of Novelty and her desire to learn human construction magic, and thinking of Novelty promptly made him feel guilty and angry, so he dropped that trail of thought soon enough. Of the last three webs, the matriarch knew little beyond generalities. The talisman bearers were apparently heavily magic-focused, most of them carrying large metal discs full of spell formulas strapped to their bodies. The ghost serpent acolytes had abandoned the Uranian Great Web belief in order to worship some kind of native spirit they found. The silent doorway adepts had either some kind of stealth magic or great teleportation skills, or maybe both, because they had a reputation for getting into inaccessible places and disappearing from them just as easily. All three had a bit of a shady reputation. The talisman bearers were known to be very greedy for magic they could use, especially magic items, which could be either very good or very bad for Zorian. The ghost serpent acolytes slavishly followed the guidance of their guardian spirit, and the ghost serpent was known to be a little erratic at times. The silent doorway adepts were thieves, or at least had a reputation for such. Zorian decided to put all three of them firmly at the bottom of his list of Iranian webs to visit. For his part, Zorian told a little bit about himself to the Matriarch, how he was studying magic in Scioria, and how he had met the Urania there. How they had helped him make sense of his abilities and learn how to control them. How they are all dead now, wiped out in totality. So Scioria changes hands once again, does it? The Matriarch asked rhetorically. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Do you happen to know which web took over? None at the moment, Zorian said. It wasn't a rival web that destroyed them. It was something else. Most likely some monster rising from the deeper section of the dungeon. Scioria has had a bit of a problem with that recently. I have heard something about that from the Night Runners, the Matriarch said. But I didn't know it was that bad. Still, expect a new web to move in soon enough. Scioria is a tempting prize. Not for us, mind you, the illustrious gem collectors are happy enough with their lot, but plenty of ambitious webs would jump at the chance to claim the place for themselves. Night Runners? Asked Zorian. A name for Urania that go between different webs to bring news and conduct trade. Don't go looking for them. Night Runners generally don't like humans. Their whole existence revolves around crossing over vast stretches of human-controlled land. Many die to mages and guns in the process. They wouldn't appreciate some random human tracking them down, regardless of the reason. The whole point of being a Night Runner is evading humans, after all, and especially mages. Got it. Don't bother the Night Runners unless I want to fight, said Zorian. Have you ever gotten in an actual fight with an Urania? The Matriarch asked curiously. Sort of, said Zorian. It didn't end all that well for me. While we are on that topic, have you ever heard of the Sword Diver's Web? Can't say that I have. Where are they from? They live under Corsa, Zorian answered. Oh, no wonder, then. Corsa is really far from us. I'm afraid that Iranian webs have very little contact with webs outside of our immediate vicinity. Other than the news we get from the Night Runners and the occasional Iranian explorer, we know little of what happens in distant webs. It may be strange to hear this, but we actually have a better picture of what humans are doing at any given point than our own kind. What did you want to know about the Sword Divers anyway? They arranged for a meeting with me and then tried to ambush me when I got there, Zorian said. Ah, the Matriarch said quietly. I am sorry to hear that. Treacherous webs like that bring a bad name to our kind. So you can't tell me why they did that? Zorian asked. It could be any number of things, the Matriarch said, adding a mental equivalent of a shrug. Urania are not nearly as homogeneous as humans in terms of culture. Zorian silently boggled at the notion of humans being culturally homogeneous. Since the relative isolation of each web quickly causes webs to develop their own peculiarities. Perhaps you insulted them somehow. Perhaps it was how they test anyone wanting to meet with their leaders. Perhaps they were simply greedy and decided you would be an easy target. I'd personally assume the latter, but who could possibly tell? Soon after that, the conversation died down and he parted ways with the illustrious gem collectors. The Matriarch told him to drop by for another chat when he was done scouting out the other webs to tell her how it went, which Zorian interpreted as, come back again soon with some more expensive gifts, but agreed to anyway. He meant it too. This visit had turned out to be far more productive than he had been hoping, and who knew what else he might learn from the Matriarch if he could get her talking again. Stopping by before the restart ended shouldn't be too much of a hassle. The next day he set off towards the Rose Labyrinth dwellers to begin his task in earnest. Despite having detailed instructions about where they live, it took Zorian an entire day of searching before he encountered any of their sentries. And an entire day of wandering the lightless tunnels, constantly doubling back after taking wrong turns and fighting the denizens of the dungeon. That black, Fire-breathing beetle whose carapace shrugged off both kinetic force and fire really gave him a scare, but thankfully it was rather slow and freezing it solid finally allowed him to kill it. The Rose Labyrinth dwellers really lived up to the labyrinth part of their name. Zorian Kaczynski of Syoria, the Iranian spokesperson began. The local matriarch declined going out to meet him, sending a small greeting party of 4 Irania instead. They had taken their sweet time considering his offer, silently communicating between themselves for nearly 2 hours, but it seemed they have finally reached their decision. We have discussed your request and reached a decision. We agree to teach you in the ways of our gift, but only if you accept our terms. Those being, asked Zorian. You will live with us for the duration of your lessons. You will eat and sleep in our settlement, hunt with our hunters, patrol our territory with our scouts and otherwise act as a member of our web. Zorian balked at the terms. How the hell did they expect him to agree to that? He knew for a fact that the Iranian idea of food was vastly different from the human one, for one thing. But frankly, even ignoring the sheer logistical problems of that idea, it required him to trust them far more than he did. He'd be at their complete mercy all day, every day. Which, now that he thought about it, was probably what they were going for. That, or they were trying to get rid of him via unreasonable terms. There is no negotiating these terms, asked Zorian. No, the spokesperson responded. If you are not willing to commit yourself, how can you expect the same of us? I will have to think about it, Zorian said. It was a dirty lie, of course, since he had already thought about it and rejected the idea with extreme prejudice. But there was no sense in being impolite. For all he knew, they thought they were being extremely reasonable. Take your time, the spokesperson said. It is not something to decide on quickly. You know where to find us if you're interested. I am sorry, but we are going to have to refuse your request, the Irania said. Perhaps if you are still interested in a couple of months from now we might be able to help you, but we are currently busy with the renovation of our settlement and cannot help you. I hope you understand. Zorian stared the 2 Irania in front of him. That the matriarch of the Yellow Cavern Guardians came to greet him with only 1 guard was already pretty strange, but her nervous, twitchy behaviors did nothing to still his paranoia. Thankfully, it didn't seem she was planning on doing anything to him, she just seemed generally stressed and frightened. In fact, her guard was just as nervous, and so was the sentry he initially contacted. The entire web seemed to be on edge for some reason. The matriarch returned his stare with one of her own, her body shifting from time to time to switch focus between him and his golem, trying to divine something about them through intense scrutiny. I am sorry if I am making you nervous, Zorian said. I assure you that the golem is dash. We are not threatened by your stupid toy. She snapped. We have far more pressing dash. She suddenly cut herself off and remained silent for a second before re-establishing telepathic communication. I am sorry. I let my temper get the better of me. Please, just leave. It is dangerous for you to remain here. You are being threatened by someone, Zorian guessed. A spike of emotion and images came from the link, hard to interpret but not totally incomprehensible. Correction, something. A monster. A thing from the depths. This talk is over, the matriarch said icily. If you don't go away, I will attack you. Perhaps I could help. Zorian tried. No, you cannot, she said. You are unwanted here. Leave. Now. What else could he do? He left. Yes. Yes. Zorian repeated in surprise. Just like that. Bridge of moonlight connecting 10,000 shores, the matriarch of the river navigators, gave him a searching look. Was I not supposed to agree? You gave a convincing offer. I could really use those telepathic relays to connect all our outposts together. I've been trying to buy some of those from the filigree sages for ages now, but the greedy bastards keep increasing the price. Honestly, considering how his previous visits had gone, He'd half expected the river navigators to consult the river currents about whether or not they should teach him and then inform him that the river said no. That was just about how his luck worked, apparently. But no, they just patiently listened to his offer and promptly agreed. It was almost anticlimactic, but Zorian wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. The filigree sages have telepathic relays. And here I thought I was being original when I made them, he complained. Though it kind of did make sense that some of the Arania would try to make something like that. It was probably more unusual that no one else had them. If it makes you feel any better, they are the only web I know of that have them, and they refuse to share them with the rest of us, Bridge of Moonlight said. They won't even sell the finished product to us, lest we figure out how to make them from live examples. Of course, the tendency of spellcasters everywhere to jealously hoard their knowledge and share bare scraps with others. A major part of why Icosian magical tradition was so successful was that it had mechanisms for overcoming that widely accessible schools to teach everyone proper basics, state-sponsored libraries to preserve spellbooks and make them available to aspiring mages, legal frameworks for apprenticeships and magical monopolies, and so on. Even with that, there were a lot of cases of mages taking priceless magical knowledge with them to their graves because they had never entrusted anyone with their secrets. Zorian decided that if he ever managed to escape from the time loop alive, he was going to write a book about psychic powers to make sure people like him don't have to jump through the same hoops he had to in order to master their abilities. He wasn't sure how much of his knowledge would be transmissible through a simple written medium, but he would try. 3 days later, when Zorian provided the first shipment of telepathic relays and proved they worked as advertised, plus warded one of their storage caves against various vermin, they introduced him to Mind Like Fire, his new mind magic teacher. "Your name is surprisingly short by Iranian standards," he told her. "The names you hear are simply approximations of their original meaning in Iranian mind speak," she said. "Our names are all of similar length, but since our languages are so different, it is often hard to translate certain concepts without ending up rather verbose. Though in my opinion, many Arania also enjoy making the translation as grandiose sounding as possible. Are you ready for your lesson?" "Yes." "Excellent. First, let me tell you what I mean to teach you. Feel free to stop me if you already know something I included in my lesson plan or have any objections." Zorian nodded, settling down on the small chair provided for him and glancing at his surroundings. The room they were in was pretty well done for something built and furnished deep in the dungeon by a bunch of giant telepathic spiders. It had a proper table and some chairs, a pair of decorative cabinets. They were completely empty. Zorian got curious and checked when he was left alone at one point, and even a couple of landscape paintings hanging of the walls. Only the lack of any windows and an expensive, clearly magical lamp perched on the table indicated that he was not in some medium-grade hotel on the surface. He found it interesting that the river navigators had a room in their settlements that was clearly intended for humans. It meant they received human visitors often enough they felt the need to make a guest room for them. He should probably ask them about that later. "The first thing I intend to teach you is how to encase your mind in a defensive mental shell. It is one of the simplest and most expensive means of mental defense, but also one of the most effective ones. The name is indicative, much like your exoskeleton protects your soft, squishy insides. Lady, I don't think you understand how human anatomy works, so too does this technique create a form of mental exoskeleton to protect your vulnerable thoughts. So, basically, it is the psychic equivalent of a mind shield spell," asked Zorian. "Show me," she demanded. Zorian complied. He channeled mana through the amulet hanging around his neck and his mind was instantly encased in a protective magical shell that repelled all mental intrusion. For a full minute, his teacher remained silent and still, unable to establish telepathic communication with him but also not giving any indication that he should drop the spell. He decided to keep it up until she signaled him somehow, but that moment never arrived. Instead, after about 2 minutes of nothing happening, her telepathic voice rang in his head again. Despite the fact the mind shield was still on. "As I thought," she said smugly. "The spell is neat in its simplicity, but it ultimately suffers from the same drawbacks common to nearly all human mind magic. Namely, it gives you no feedback whatsoever when attacks start interacting with your defenses. You didn't even feel it when I slipped past it, did you? I do feel it when sufficiently powerful attacks interact with it, Zorian protested. That's not feedback, that's damage leaking through without totally collapsing the whole thing, she scoffed. No, while this thing may have served you in the past, it is thoroughly inadequate for my purposes. A real mind shell, the sort I will teach you to produce, will be far better than this. It will be many times stronger than what your spell can manage, and infinitely more adaptive and responsive. You will be able to sense probing attacks, too subtle to actually damage your defenses but indicative of what your opponent is planning. You will be able to repair and reinforce your defenses without tearing the whole thing down and starting from scratch. You will be able to strike back without dropping your whole mental shield to do so. Sounds wonderful, Zorian said. He collapsed the spell, since it clearly wasn't doing anything at the moment. Though if I may be so rude, I do think there is one thing where human magics generally beat your psychic powers. Oh. They generally require no attention from the caster to keep affecting the target, and they expose the caster to far less risk of mental retaliation by their victims. From what I can tell, that is not true for psychic powers. True, she acknowledged. But I think the inflexible nature of those spells is too much of a weakness to make up for those advantages. But we've digressed enough. After you learn how to defend your mind a bit, we will move on to attack and retaliation. It did not take long for Zorian to realize that Mind Like Fire was very serious about her job. Far from teaching him only the bare minimum and meeting him once a week or so like he had assumed she would, she scheduled lessons with him every single day and demanded every shred of effort and patience he could spare. The lessons basically consisted of him lovingly constructing a mental shell around his mind before Mind Like Fire mercilessly took it apart, only backing off when his defenses collapsed from the strain. It was a good thing he had decided not to turn on his suicide contingencies before going into her lessons, because they would have gone off at the end of the very first day due to all the headaches he had suffered in the process. Still, Zorian couldn't complain. This was basically what he was searching for all this time, wasn't it? True, it was a lot more painful than he had imagined, leaving him bedridden for hours after the lessons ended, but it was also a lot more effective than he had thought it would be. His ability to shield his mind was improving fast, and after the first week Mind Like Fire started bringing guest teachers to give him experience with attacks different from her own. Not that everything was perfect. For one thing, Mind Like Fire had a spin-like obsession with getting the basics right and refused to teach him anything else until he mastered the mind shell technique to her liking, and she had some pretty high standards. For another, the river navigators spontaneously raised the price of their cooperation twice, first demanding of him another 10 relays if he wanted to continue the lessons, and then urging him to help them kill some kind of giant mole monster that was threatening one of their outposts. The mole thing didn't look particularly dangerous to Zorian, but apparently it was resistant to mind magic and too tough to bring down with their meager magical skills. Though annoyed at the sudden and completely unwarranted demands, Zorian decided to play things their way, easily producing another 10 relays and luring the giant mole into a minefield he had set up for it. As tempted as he was to break the whole arrangement on principle, the fact was that Mind Like Fire was simply too good of a teacher to lose. Before the restart ended, Zorian had once again visited the illustrious gem collectors, gifted them some more crystallized mana, to the Matriarch's continued protests that he was being too generous, and told them a little about his experiences. They had nothing new to tell him, however, so his visit was largely pointless in the end. Upon the start of the next restart he once again teleported to Nyazov Dveri to perform his preparations and then promptly contacted the river navigators with the offer, deciding not to contact the illustrious gem collectors this time. The river navigators were just as quick to accept his offer as they had been in the previous restart, and they once again assigned Mind Like Fire as his teacher. Not particularly surprising, as he soon found out. Now that he showed some pre-existing skill, she actually allowed him to have some breaks during the lessons where she would tell him a little about herself and her web. She was literally their mind magic teacher, and was thus the most logical person for the job. Although she usually taught Iranian children, rather than adults. Maybe Zorian was a little too prideful, but the fact that they had sent their elementary school teacher to conduct his lessons kind of burned. "Prepare yourself," Mind Like Fire suddenly stated, and Zorian knew the break was over. He quickly erected the shell around his mind, a simple blast of telepathic noise washing over it harmlessly. Mind blasts like that one were the simplest form of telepathic attack, one that even Zorian could produce, and they had no chance in hell of punching through a solid defense like he was currently sporting. It was the fastest attack most telepaths could manage, though, and Mind Like Fire always started a battle with one of those to see if she could catch him unprepared with it. That used to actually happen, back when he was still starting and was struggling to call up the mental shell on a moment's notice, but even after it stopped working on him, she persisted in doing that at the start of every battle. Immediately after the blast subsided, he felt pinpricks skittering across his shell, looking for flaws and weaknesses. He had tried to be clever in the past by deliberately creating weak spots and then quickly shoring them up when she committed to an attack, but he quickly learned that was a risky tactic to employ at his level of skill, so these days he was more passive and reactive. Soon enough, once she was convinced there were no obvious flaws in his defense, she tried to create some. Sudden, concentrated mental bursts slammed into his mental shell, seeking to crack it by concentrating all their energy against a specific portion of the shell. He recognized that attack as the one that the sword divers had used to smash his mind shield spell and ravage his mind. Not surprising they had used that, he was informed, since that type of attack was specifically designed to punch through mental barriers. Mind Spike, the Arania called it. Unlike the last time he was faced with this attack mode, however, he had a shiny new mental defense and was facing only one attacker. He felt the spikes hit his shield, but it held, and he quickly repaired all the damage and reinforced that part of the shell to withstand future attacks. Mind Like Fire promptly switched targets, bombarding another, different portion of his mental shell. And when that didn't work, she moved on to the next, and the next, steadily speeding up her attacks until Zorian was straining to hold his mental shell intact. She began mixing in low-powered probing attacks between mind spikes, masking the tiny pinpricks among the sheer intensity of her barrage and looking for any cracks created by her assault. Zorian frantically worked to patch up damage and reinforce the shell in places where he detected her probes, and somehow held on until her attack attenuated. Success. His shell usually cracked during that last phase. Maybe now she would. A massive vice of telepathic pressure closed around his mind from all sides, crushing and grinding without mercy or end. The attack, the unimaginatively but appropriately named Mind Crush, closed around his mental shell like an armored fist around a soap bubble. And, weakened as it was from the previous barrage, the shell promptly broke like one too. Zorian experienced a brief flash of blinding pain in his head before Mind Like Fire realized she'd won and let the attack dissipate. "Yes," Mind Like Fire said simply. "Ugh," Zorian groaned. "I'll give you 5 minutes before we go for round 2, she said. "I take back everything nice I've ever thought about you," Zorian told her. "You're pure evil. My other students agree with you. There is a reason why I was named Mind Like Fire, you see," she said. 4 more minutes left. Damn it. As the weeks went by, Zorian became increasingly bored with Mind Like Fire's lessons. While they continued to pay results in terms of his increasing mental combat proficiency, they were also very repetitive and had increasingly marginal results. It didn't help that his mental defenses were by now too good to be casually collapsed by his teacher, which meant that he no longer ended the lessons with a raging headache and an urge to lay down for a few hours. The lessons mostly just taxed his patience now, leaving him a bit tired and frustrated but otherwise ready to do something else. He decided to do just that. He had never really finished sounding out the rest of the Arania, wanting to get some basics of mental combat from the river navigators first, but he was becoming increasingly certain that Mind Like Fire was stalling him with her demands at mastery in order to avoid teaching him anything more advanced. His mental defenses were already good enough, in his opinion, so there was no harm in giving the other webs a visit to see what their offer was. The luminous advocates were his first destination. They were, after all, supposed to be very interested in teaching someone like him, as well as hungry for resources he could provide. Unfortunately, that didn't quite work out. Their initial offer was utterly ridiculous, calling for Zorian to pay a simply staggering amount of money in magical artifacts. He didn't agree to that, of course couldn't, actually, even if he wanted to, since the whole thing would cost twice as much as he had on his person. Even if he gathered all of his savings and sold every single mana crystal he'd found under Nyazov Dveri, it still wouldn't be enough. It took more than 3 weeks to talk them into a more reasonable price, since they seemed to finally realize he was in a hurry. By that time, the restart was already near its end. Undeterred, he tried to approach them again over the next 4 restarts, varying his approach, but in the end only managed to reduce the negotiation period by a couple of days. Admittedly, the few lessons he actually managed to finagle out of them really were top-notch. Not only did they give him some crucial advice in regards to strengthening his mental shell that really sped up his progress in mind like Fire's lessons, they also helped him hone other aspects of his psychic abilities. For instance, he was now capable of forming two-way telepathic links that allowed non-psychics to talk back to him mentally, as well as form links with multiple people at once. They even taught him how to better handle the information from divination spells which dumped their results directly into the mind of the caster. Some useful information, that. Nonetheless, Zorian decided to give up on seeking their help after the 4th restart. While their help was useful, the sheer amount of time and nerves he lost arranging for said help to actually materialize made the whole thing a poor deal in his mind. It didn't help that they categorically refused to teach him memory manipulation unless he subjected himself to a total memory probe, courtesy of their elders, which made their web a bit of a dead end as far as he was concerned. Because that was basically never going to happen. Since negotiation with the luminous advocates involved a whole lot of waiting for the web to respond to his offers, Zorian had time to approach the filigree sages at the same time. They too took a lot of time to convince, although in their case it was because they were a suspicious bunch and also more than a little bit unhappy about him selling telepathic relays to the river navigators. Thankfully, the first time he managed to convince them to teach him, he immediately found a shortcut that allowed him to drastically cut down on the negotiation time necessary to convince them. All he had to do was demonstrate his proficiency with spell formulas and promise to help them adapt human techniques to their own webcraft. They cared about that a lot more than about any material trade goods, and so long as he did so it only took a week of negotiation before they agreed to teach him. Zorian was more than a little shocked when he was first shown an example of the filigree sage's webcraft. He had expected something relatively simple and crude, like a piece of spider silk cloth with familiar Icosian symbology embedded into it, or perhaps even individual threads woven into the glyphs. Instead, the filigree sage crafter he was to work with led him to a rectangular formation of stone pillars, in the middle of which was suspended a complex, multi-layered sphere made out of spider silk. The sphere glowed with pale white light in the darkness of the room, points of brighter lights constantly racing along this or that thread in a complicated dance that Zorian couldn't decipher. Every inch of its surface, as well as every inch of the inner layers too, he would later find out, was covered in glyphs. Unfamiliar, non-Icosian glyphs. And his guide claimed this was just one of the lesser practice spheres, since they weren't going to bring a potentially untrustworthy outsider anywhere near the real thing. He had realized at that point that he had bitten off far more than he could chew. Helping the filigree sages refine their webcraft basically required becoming adept in a whole different tradition of making spell formulas. A tradition that descended from the Icosian one, thus making the job much easier, but still. This was a task that could take years. Not something that you could do on the side while focusing on something else. He still gave it an honest try, mostly by completely giving up on rest and free time for several restarts, and the filigree sages seemed pleased by his work, but in the end he decided that he simply couldn't justify the spent effort to himself. While the topic itself was extremely interesting indeed, many researchers would have quite literally killed to be in his place. Studying an otherwise unknown magical tradition, it was ultimately a distraction he, at the moment, didn't need. And really, the actual mind magic instruction he was getting in exchange for his work was little different from what the river navigators were offering. He did admittedly get to experience a slightly different style of mental combat from the one practiced by river navigators and most other Iranian webs, since the filigree sages used methods that revolved around group combat. Not very useful to him, since he didn't have a fellow telepath to use it with, but he did learn some tricks to deal with multiple attackers. Originally, the filigree sages were completely unwilling to teach Zorian any form of memory manipulation. However, after 2 restarts of studying their webcraft, it became impossible to pretend he was starting from scratch. The next time around, he used an excuse that he'd learned the bare basics from the Sciorian web. He was promptly taken to their matriarch, who had mostly ignored him up until then, preferring to have her underlings interact with him, who seemed very keen on sending an expedition to Scioria with Zorian's help in order to establish some kind of contact with the Sciorian web. Not even finding out they had all been killed dampened her enthusiasm for the idea of an expedition to Scioria. It just meant the focus of the expedition shifted from establishing contact to looting the place down to bedrock. Lovely. Regardless, in exchange for transporting the expedition to Scioria, protecting them from any threats and transporting them back, Zorian was promised just about anything, really. Even memory manipulation was on the table. Aside from the fact that agreeing to such a thing would require Zorian to go back to Scioria, and the fact that he would be helping a group of Arania loot the remains of his friends, there was the little matter of him not being actually sure that the Sciorian web actually used any webcraft. He suspected they did, and many of the things the matriarch had mentioned in her stories and offhand comments seemed to indicate so in retrospect, but he wasn't actually certain. It was just an excuse he made up to explain his otherwise inexplicable knowledge. He should definitely go down into the ruins of Scioria's web and check to see what's in there before agreeing to any such expeditions. With the luminous advocates and the filigree sages essentially eliminated from the list of options, at least for the time being, Zorian was left with only 3 options to serve as an alternative to the river navigators. The 3 shady webs that the illustrious gem collectors had warned him about. Zorian was about to start approaching them when Mind Like Fire finally decided to move on from basic telepathic combat drills. When Mind Like Fire declared that Zorian's mental defenses were passable, and that they would be switching over to honing his offensive arsenal, he was cautiously optimistic but didn't expect much. Practice would probably become less painful, since Mind Like Fire would be on the receiving end of attacks this time, but he didn't really think his attacks would be very effective. Her mental defenses were bound to be excellent. But then Mind Like Fire told him to hit her with his best shot and simply stood there, content to passively weather the attack, and Zorian decided to oblige her. He dumped a positively huge amount of mana into his next attack, the most he could manage without the entire thing losing cohesion, and slammed it straight into her mental shell. The results were beyond all of his expectations. Rather than simply bouncing off her mental shell like he had expected, the attack effortlessly blew her defenses away and slammed into her unprotected mind like a battering ram. She screeched in pain, spasming and flailing with her whole body, and, for a brief while, there was pandemonium as other nearby Arania burst into the room to see what the fuss was about. Zorian tried to explain what had happened without the whole thing devolving into a fight. For a moment he was sure he would have to flee and was already clutching the recall rod in his hand to teleport away, but Mind Like Fire recovered in time to defuse the situation. She also insisted on continuing the lessons as if nothing notable had happened, and proceeded to shoo away all the other Arania that had come to her defense. Damnation, Mind Like Fire grumbled once they were alone again. Not only did I get taken down by a human rookie, but everyone saw it too. I won't live this one down for a long while. Sorry, tried Zorian. He wasn't sure what to even tell her, in all honesty. Don't be, she said. It's my fault, really your inexperience has automatically put me in the mind of one of our young and I foolishly assumed your attack would be like one of theirs. But while your skills at mental combat leave much to be desired, you are still a qualified mage with plenty of mana to burn and considerable experience in managing it. I should have let you face my best defenses and then lowered the strength afterwards. I should have waited to see what your strongest attack was like instead of making assumptions about how strong my shield needed to be. Let that be a lesson to you as well. Should you ever teach someone, it is always unwise to be arrogant and carelessly presumptuous, lest you get taken down by some precocious hatchling. He was not a freaking hatchling. He was only a year away from being legally recognized as an adult, and was already one if the time spent in the time loop was factored in. I didn't do anything permanent, did I? Zorian asked instead. No, of course not. Why do you think, I see that in my haste to bring your practical skills to a workable level, I have neglected some crucial bits of theory. Like what happens when an attacker manages to break through the defender's defenses. Bad things, tried Zorian. Yes, but perhaps not quite as bad as you'd think, she countered. To grossly simplify things, there are 4 main things one can do to an unshielded target. The first is to simply assault their mind telepathically, seeking to damage it. This is, in almost every case, simply a way to incapacitate the target for a while. It is very difficult to actually kill people through purely mental attacks. Usually such attacks simply cause a lot of pain and make the target lose consciousness for a while. Maybe quite a while, and they may suffer from headaches, confusion and amnesia for a time, but even then they are almost guaranteed to eventually recover. Oh. I didn't know that, Zorian admitted. He honestly thought that getting hit by a sufficiently powerful telepathic barrage could cripple you permanently. Then again, for a while could perhaps mean months or years, so still not something to take lightly. And he was pretty sure a pain-inducing attack could be easily adapted to an instrument of torture. So you were never in any permanent danger, then, but you'll probably be hurting for a while. Yes, that is the short of it. And the other 3 things the attacker could do to the target? Zorian asked. Well, the second possibility is that the attacker extracts information out of the target either by reading their thoughts or probing their memories. Reading thoughts is the easiest option, of course, but often ineffective. Arania, mages, and quite a few human civilians as well, have learned to maintain certain discipline over their surface thoughts, making it hard to pluck information out of their minds that way. That leaves deep memory reading, and this is not nearly as easy as it sounds, as most people have quite a lot of memories to sift through and can sense when someone is rooting through their heads and resist. Even non-psychics can resist deep memory scans, if they're strong-willed and the psychic isn't very practiced in the skill. Zorian remained silent. He had raised the possibility of being taught memory manipulation plenty of times in the past, and she had always told him he wasn't ready yet. He couldn't imagine her answer would be any different now. At least it wasn't a flat-out no, he supposed. The third and fourth options are what we Arania call deep and surface manipulations. Surface manipulations consist of temporary manipulations, such as fooling the senses or amplifying a particular emotion in the victim to produce a desired reaction. Deep manipulations, on the other hand, are more permanent. They consist of things such as modifying someone's memories, blanking out entire sections of their life, instilling lasting compulsions or turning them into unaware sleeper agents. Deep techniques are what a lot of humans associate mind magic with, but they are actually rarely used. Such lasting mental alterations require the attacker to dive deep into the victim's mind and spend a lot of time tweaking things, making them hard and time-consuming to use. This is not something you use in a fight, this is something you do to a foe that has been decisively defeated and cannot strike back at you at all. Even among us Arania it is considered something of a dark art. Few of us are proficient in its use. Zorian sighed. This is all leading up to an explanation about why you don't want to teach me any memory manipulation, isn't it? He said out loud. Yes and no, Mind like Fire said carefully. So a no couched in flowery language, said Zorian derisively. Man, that's the third refusal in a row. I'm going to have to find more webs to investigate. Oh, have you gone to other webs with this? She asked, not in the least bothered by his little outburst. Sounds like quite a story, you'll have to tell me about it later. But don't write us off yet. While it's true that we are not ready to let you root through our minds, even as practice, that doesn't mean we can't help prepare you for when you do eventually find an Arania brave enough to let you read her memories. And you're going to do that by. The main problem you are facing when trying to read Iranian minds is that our ways of perceiving the world are very different from yours. Our many eyes allow us to see the world in 3 different ways, only one of which, the one provided by our pair of big, forward-facing eyes, is in any way analogous to human vision. We can also sense vibrations through our legs, and our sense of touch is much more sophisticated than yours. It's how we can navigate through the tunnels so easily with no light to see by. You can't see in the dark? Asked Zorian. Most dungeon dwellers could. No, we need at least a little light to see, she said. We do have excellent low-light vision though. But we're getting off track. What I'm trying to say is that even if you received access to an Iranian memory, you probably would not be able to parse it. If you want to be able to read Iranian memories, you first need to learn how to process the way we perceive the world. And that is where I can help you. I can let you tap into my senses and let you adjust to them. I can even package some of my more inconsequential memories into little packets and send them to you over the telepathic link to help you understand how to deal with memory packages. Oh, Zorian said lamely. Yeah, that did sound useful. Somewhat mollified by her response, he switched back to telepathic communication. So can we perhaps switch to that right now? I must admit I am getting thoroughly sick of combat drills. I know it's important to practice my mental shields, believe me, but I'm going to go crazy if this continues for much longer. As a matter of fact, yes. I had wanted to wait with such instruction until you could actually break through my mental shields before starting you on that path, but you did succeed with that. Not in a way I had expected or planned for, but fair is fair. We shall start with surface manipulations, since you will need some proficiency with them before you can tap into someone's senses. How much did your other Iranian teachers tell you about them? Very little, other than the fact that they exist, Zorian said. But surface manipulations are basically mind control, yes. We covered those back in my Mage Academy. Only theoretically, with an emphasis on identifying the type of mind control and how to fight it, but still. Summarize those lessons for me, please, Mind Like Fire ordered. I'd like to see what I'm working with. With a wave of his hands, Zorian created a glowing geometric diagram that was informally known as the Mind Control Rectangle among the students and whose official name escaped Zorian at the moment. It was something far too loquacious and complicated for what were basically 4 words arranged into a simple 2x2 grid. A rectangle divided into 4 smaller ones, each of the 4 major methods of manipulating people through mind magic assigned its own corner. Domination, suggestion. Puppeteering, illusion. Pretty, Mind Like Fire deadpanned. But I must confess I have never learned how to read human script, so you'll have to explain to me what that means. Ah. Right. He sometimes forgot that for all that Arania interacted with humans, they were still alien beings with a completely different culture. Icosians had possessed an almost religious reverence for the written word, and had spread literacy to every place that had fallen under their domination, so literacy was near universal in places they'd once ruled over. Universal literacy most likely made it much easier to train as many people as possible into mages as well, thus providing tangible benefits for the policy. The Arania, on the other hand, had no such tradition, and probably couldn't use human-style writing effectively anyway. He knew that the Sciorian web had a number of Arania that could read and write, but most Arania probably had no need to master such skills. Zorian waved his hands again and the illusion split in half, separating the rectangle into left and right halves. Domination and puppeteering on the left side, suggestion and illusion on the right side. Domination and puppeteering are forceful methods, he said. The target knows they are being targeted by a spell, and will usually be furious at the caster when it ends. As such, they are usually used in combat situations, against people who are clear enemies to you. Suggestion and illusion are subtle methods. The target doesn't automatically become aware they have been affected, and in fact the goal is for them to remain unaware as long as possible. They are generally used for criminal and espionage purposes. Compulsion spells on the top, hijacking spells on the bottom, forceful spells on the left and subtle spells on the right. Yup, he'd covered everything. He let the illusion evaporate into smoke and settled down to wait for Mind Like Fire's response. An interesting breakdown, she said. It has a sort of simplistic beauty to it. I'll have to remember that one. The reality is far more complex and less sharply defined, but we'll get to that later, when it's actually relevant. I was never very big on spending time on theory, truth be told. We've wasted enough time on it today and I'd like to get started on something productive. The resulting lesson was exceptionally painful, reminding Zorian of his initial lessons with her, several restarts in the past ago, and despite her insistence she was being no harder on him than she was on any of her other students, Zorian knew the sudden ferocity of her lessons was her revenge for catching her off guard. On the bright side, she calmed down after a week of that. On the less bright side, he would have to piss her off like that on every subsequent restart as well, so he was looking at a week of painful headaches at the start of every restart. Sometimes you just couldn't win. As it turned out, Mind Like Fire's statement about him being unable to understand Iranian senses turned out to be not just correct, but a vast understatement. Even after a full month of practice, he couldn't make heads or tails of Iranian senses. Even trying to limit his sensory tap into their vision alone left him dizzy and confused, and the less said of their sense of touch, the better. They had a rudimentary sense of taste on their leg hairs. They tasted the ground they walked on. Why for the love of all that was holy would a species need to have an ability like that? It also put Novelty's habit of touching everything, him included, in an entirely new and unsettling light. Not that he'd learned nothing during the entire month. Mind Like Fire did manage to teach him how to affect the minds of others in minor ways. Some of these, like the ability to induce spasms and limb failure, he already knew how to produce, but not very consistently before he'd been lectured on the proper way of hijacking other people's nervous systems. Others, like inducing full-body paralysis, lightly dampening or amplifying their emotions, subtly redirecting their attention away from things or inducing failure of one or more of their senses were wholly new to him. But while these things were all unquestionably useful, the total lack of progress on the one thing that he really had to master hit him hard. In the end, he reluctantly decided to consult the luminous advocates for help. As much as they annoyed him, they probably had an answer to his problem. He managed to short-circuit the negotiations with them only 2 weeks into the restart by simply paying their ridiculous price. It required spending day after day on exploration of the lower levels of Nyazov Dveri's dungeon and selling everything of worth he had found there, but he did manage to talk them down to something halfway reasonable and then just pay them off. According to the luminous advocates, his main problem was that he was basically trying to take on too big of a challenge at once. For one thing, he was trying to tap into the senses of another while still retaining his own, forcing his mind to process different perspectives at once. And no, sitting still with his eyes closed was not nearly enough to get around that. In order to deal with that issue, the luminous advocates taught him how to turn his mental abilities inwards and shut off one or more of his senses, leaving only the foreign sensory stream for his mind to process. Their second suggestion was that he had to practice sensory tap on something easier first. Preferably his fellow humans, as their senses were closest to his own, but some of the more similar animals might also suffice. Only once he'd mastered the art of tapping into the senses of his fellow humans should he bother trying to tap into something as alien as an Arania. When Zorian tried to do just that by tapping into the senses of a random passerby in a nearby town, he realized they were completely correct. He nearly collapsed from disorientation, even though he was only tapping into familiar human senses this time. It would be a long time before he could move on to something more exotic than a human, it seemed. Which presented him with something of a problem. While Zorian's mental abilities were currently good enough that he didn't fear discovery every time he used them on some random civilian, he could hardly guarantee that he would never mess up and reveal to his target that he was messing with their heads. And frankly, you could never really be sure that your target really was a random civilian. It was all too possible to step into the mind of some high-ranking mage good at blending in with the crowd, or to encounter a civilian trained to detect such intrusions. And the response of the Mage Guild to rogue mind mages was harsh. He didn't want a guild hunter team after him, even if the time loop would probably shield him from the worst of the consequences. And that was without even considering the moral dimension of the whole thing. Picking on innocent people for the sake of personal training was not the road he wanted to go on, and dismissing their plight as irrelevant due to the time loop struck him as an unhealthy attitude to have. He might have justified the whole thing to himself if it was just a matter of tapping into their senses, since that was mostly harmless, but the luminous advocates made it clear this wasn't the only skill he would have to practice on his fellow humans to get right. He would encounter the exact same issues when he tried to master memory manipulation even after accounting for their different senses. Iranian minds were sufficiently different that he would need to practice on something more similar to himself before he tried to interpret their memories. And practicing memory probes was neither safe, harmless, nor inconspicuous. He needed an acceptable target. Zorian walked carefully through the streets of Scioria, scanning the crowds for any signs of hostility with every sense he had available. He had a feeling his tension and nervousness was very obvious to people around him, but then again he was hardly the only person who was nervous. The random monsters welling up from the dungeon had spooked many a native, and there was a sense of tension in the city that hadn't been there the last time he'd been in the city. This was his second recent visit to Scioria, and it was just as uneventful as his first. He had even deliberately walked into some back alleys and more isolated parts of the city to see if Red Robe or one of his agents would confront him once he was out of the public eye, but no such things happened. He wasn't even confronted by a band of rough-looking men trying to steal his belongings, like it usually happened in the trashy adventure novels he read from time to time. Sighing, he twisted the top of the recall rod hanging off his belt and was promptly teleported to the outskirts of the city. The location was totally unremarkable. It wasn't lived in, and had been trapped to hell and back over the course of several weeks. Zorian could come and go as he pleased, but if the wards surrounding the area detected anyone other than him appearing inside, it would unleash a plethora of traps on the interloper, the nastiest and most lethal of traps that he had the capacity to make and install. He repeated the action 3 times in quick succession, recalling himself to 3 additional, similar spots, walked off in a random direction for an hour or so and then finally teleported himself to his real destination. 2 days later, when no one tried to track him down to a small, remote village he'd chosen for his current base, mostly because it was in the middle of nowhere with nothing but fields of wheat for miles in any direction, he finally breathed a sigh of relief and promptly started planning his next foray into the city. Next time he was checking out the Urania ruins to see if Red Robe had put any tripwires there to alert him of intruders coming there. When Zorian first got the idea of going back to Scioria, he had immediately dismissed it as madness. He wasn't ready, and acting prematurely could potentially ruin everything. However, the more he thought about it, the more he liked the idea. Red Robe clearly wasn't trying to locate him anymore. If he had been doing so, Zorian wouldn't have lasted nearly as long as he had, he was quite sure of that. Why Red Robe felt no need to locate him, when he clearly wanted to get rid of any rival time travelers, Zorian did not know. He'd feared that the other time traveler had maybe placed tripwires in Scioria to alert him when he came back, but even that seemed increasingly unlikely at this point. Zorian had been all over Scioria during his 2 brief forays into the city, even in parts of the academy, and nothing of note happened. That was important, partly because Zorian felt like he was going a little crazy and desperately wanted to see some familiar faces, at least for a short while, but also because Scioria held some perfect targets for him to practice his growing mind magic skills on. The Matriarch solved at least a part of the time loop's mystery by ferreting out information from the heads of Abasan invaders and their supporters. Why couldn't Zorian do the same? He would not only be advancing his abilities in preparations of opening the Matriarch's memory package, he would also be tackling the mystery of the time loop from another direction. Two birds with one stone. He wasn't going to move back into the city yet. He would continue testing the place for a while still. Try to spend a whole week in there, show up for a class or two. But if Red Robe's response turned out to be as non-existent as this? His long exile from the city was about to end. Zorian spent the next 3 restarts alternating between Mind Like Fire's lessons and making forays into Scioria. He was never attacked while in Scioria, not even when he combed through the Iranian corpse-filled settlement in one of the restarts. A part of him felt that was highly suspicious, but ultimately it didn't keep him away from the place. Especially since he was starting to reach the limits of what Mind Like Fire was willing to teach him. His mental defenses were top-notch, and his ability to strike back at hostile minds was nothing to scoff at either. Even Mind Like Fire admitted she actually had to take him seriously these days. She had taught him all of the simple tricks and basic techniques she dared give him access to, and he was even getting the hang of tapping into Iranian senses. The luminous advocates were right, it went a whole lot easier after he had mastered the art of tapping into purely human senses first. If he wanted to get any benefit from her teachings, he would have to spend a few restarts practicing deep memory scans on humans first. Of course, that would require finding an Irania that was willing to teach him even the basics of such memory scans. Mind Like Fire's reaction to that was a firm refusal, since that would involve lowering all of her defenses and letting Zorian dive deep into her private memories. Even among themselves, the Irania considered such an act to be one of great trust and significance. It didn't help that when Mind Like Fire challenged Zorian to provide similar access to his own memories to her, he had little choice but to say no. He did know that the filigree sages were willing to play along if he let them loot the Scioria settlement, but Zorian had been unable to find much in the way of webcraft when he searched the settlement in one of his brief forays, so he wasn't sure whether that would actually work out at all. Then, near the end of the last restart, something interesting happened. Zorian had gotten permission from Bridge of Moonlight to stay in the River Navigator's main settlement for a while after he helped them dig up a brand new cavern with alteration spells, and was present in the Matriarch's chamber when a messenger from the Yellow Cavern Guardians arrived to plead with the River Navigator's Matriarch for help. The Yellow Cavern Guardians, he had found, were on the verge of extinction. A few days before the start of the time loop, the caverns from which they got their name and which their survival and prosperity depended on had been taken over by some huge monster from the deeper levels of the dungeon. The creature was too magic resistant to be affected with mind magic, extremely tough, and also regenerated. Roughly a week and a half into the restart, the Yellow Cavern Guardians were starting to get desperate. In an attempt to retake their cavern, they had decided to launch an all-out attack, seeking to drive the monster off. It was an utter disaster, and the Yellow Cavern Guardians lost both their matriarch and her 2 successors/assistants/somethings. Now leaderless as well as desperate, the Yellow Cavern Guardians went into a panic. Well, they claimed they deliberated things, but Zorian knew how to read between the lines, before begging for help from anyone they thought would listen. Sadly for them, the River Navigators had no intention of messing around with a creature capable of taking on an entire Iranian web and winning. Fortunately for them, Zorian was not nearly so intimidated. The last time he'd offered aid, he'd been rudely refused. But last time, he'd asked at the start of the restart, when their leadership had still been alive and believed they could handle things. They had probably been more worried about him taking advantage of their momentary weakness and had not felt they needed all the help they could get. Now that their leadership was dead, however, they were not in a position to be nearly as picky. He didn't even have to ask. The messenger approached him with a plea for help on her own, after Bridge of Moonlight blew the messenger off and she'd realized that Zorian was there. After hammering out some basic agreement, which could be summarized as, "We'll agree to anything, just give us back our cavern." Zorian recalled himself and the messenger to the recall stone he had left on the surface and then immediately teleported them to where he knew the Yellow Cavern Guardians were. The messenger seemed shocked he knew where to find them without her guidance, and a bit disoriented from the rapid succession of teleporting, but she recovered quickly and led him to what passed as leadership of their web for the moment. Several hours later, he found himself at the entrance to a vast cave overgrown with a fungal forest, a pair of yellow cavern guards watching him from deeper into the access tunnel. Supposedly they were ready to intervene if he ran into trouble at any point, but he was pretty sure they were just going to stay on their asses if he got attacked, and then, if he lost, mournfully report he had tragically ended up as Monster Chow before they could do anything. They seemed terrified even to be there. Zorian created a floating eye out of ectoplasm and sent it deeper into the cave to get some basic sense of its contents and layout. His recent practice with tapping into other people's senses made processing what the eye was sending him child's play, and he no longer had to close his eyes to use it. He had to admit one thing: the cavern was simply breathtaking. It was huge, and almost entirely covered with a dizzying variety of giant mushrooms. The more familiar umbrella mushrooms existed between ones that resembled leafless trees and long, fleshy spikes and berries. Looking over them, Zorian even spotted several that appeared to be whitish plants rather than mushrooms, complete with small flowers and atrophied leaves. The largest of them glowed with a faint blue light that suffused the entire cavern with weak, shadowy light. Underground forests like this one were treasure troves of information and interesting alchemical ingredients, and were highly sought after by both humans and dungeon denizens. And this one was both huge and largely unspoiled. No wonder the yellow cavern guardians were so protective of it. His appreciation of the view was quickly interrupted. However, the monster wasn't hard to find. It was right in the center of the cave, sitting like a king in a small, shallow lake situated there. Well, shallow in a relative sense. Zorian could have submerged himself easily in its center, but it was barely a puddle for the monster who towered over the waters. It looked like a giant frog, albeit one whose mother had mated with a troll and which was then raised solely on muscle growth potions from the day it was born. Knobby, dark green skin covered a creature that was at least 5 meters tall, even while crouching, and its limbs were thick and practically bursting at the seams from the sheer muscles it was sporting. Oh, and they ended in huge, sharp claws rather than suction cups. One of the frog thing's eyes swiveled in its socket to focus on Zorian's ectoplasmic eye, noticing the intruder, but the creature remained motionless and eventually returned to its silent vigil, ignoring the sensor. The monster had knocked down all the fungus surrounding the lake, probably to give itself a better view of its new domain, and was now just standing in the lake in the center, periodically shifting in place so it could stare at the different parts of the cavern. Zorian dismissed the sensor and turned to the 2 guards behind him. "I'm going to need a few days to prepare," he said. 3 days before the end of the restart, Zorian was ready to try and kill the giant frog monster that had driven the yellow cavern guardians out of their home. His plan was simple: fire. Lots and lots of fire. When he finally arrived at the cavern entrance, he first made sure the frog thing was still where he had last left it, and then carefully lowered an ignition stone into the crate full of highly flammable alchemical bricks he had been levitating behind him. Once that was done, he created an illusion around the crate to make it look like an arania and sent it floating along the ground towards the monster. He trailed after the crate under the guise of invisibility, a huge, solid steel golem trailing beside him. The golem was fully visible, and mostly served as a big, visible target for the creature's ire if this whole thing went south. Zorian had considered a number of methods to trick the monster into eating the decoy, but none of them turned out to be necessary. It seemed that the claims of the Yellow Cavern Guardians about how the creature loved eating arania were spot on, because the creature barely even looked at the disguised crate before attacking. A long, ropey, blood-red tongue lashed out at the crate with dizzying speed, reeling it into its wide-open maw in the blink of an eye. The moment the frog thing's mouth snapped shut, Zorian sent a mana burst at the ignition stone in the crate, causing the whole thing to blow up in its mouth. The resulting scream was quite possibly the most disturbing sound he'd ever heard in his entire life. It wasn't a croak or anything even remotely frog-like. It sounded like a whole herd of pigs being slaughtered messily, over and over and over again. The frog thing vomited a stream of fire, blood and bile, trying to expel the offending substance to no avail. Zorian had specifically chosen an alchemical product whose fire clung to the surface like glue, and no matter how hard it tried, it could not remove the burning gunk that covered its insides. Truthfully, its attempt to vomit out the compound was only making things worse. It would have had more luck by keeping its mouth shut and trying to starve the fire of oxygen. Sadly, after a few more futile attempts, the monster suddenly stopped struggling, noticed Zorian and his golem, and immediately charged towards them. Zorian silently motioned for his golem to meet the creature's charge with one of its own, not even questioning how the creature knew he was there. Dungeon denizens had all kinds of ridiculous abilities and senses, especially powerful ones like these. He sent a wave of force at the creature's feet, managing to trip it up a bit and allowing his golem to slam its metal fist straight into its face. Though much bigger than his creation, the creature seemed momentarily stunned at the hit and didn't have enough time to dodge when Zorian hit it with a massive fireball. Annoyingly, it still wasn't dead. It screamed again, scorched from both inside and outside, its eyes reduced to ruined husks by the fireball. But it still found enough strength to tear apart his golem, which he had spent ages crafting and reinforcing, in a flurry of violence. It ripped both of its arms out of their sockets, snapped the main body in half, and flung the pieces into the distance. The armless remains of the upper torso impacted the ground not far from Zorian, but he remained silent and still, hoping to avoid notice. It would have been nice to say that what followed next was some epic battle where he bravely strode forth to finish the monster once and for all, but in truth, he simply evaded the creature's notice and waited as it rampaged throughout the forest for a while, looking for more targets. The loss of its vision seemed to really hurt it, and it never even came close to detecting his location. At some point it simply stopped and keeled over, finally dead after having succumbed to its many wounds. Still, a victory was a victory, wasn't it? His guards had fled from their posts at some point in the battle, so Zorian slowly made his way towards the Yellow Cavern Guardians' temporary camp to give them the good news. The two Yellow Cavern Guardians that came to check up if he was telling the truth stared silently at the charred corpse of the frog thing that had nearly ruined them. Zorian tried to be respectful and wait for them come to terms with the fact that he had actually succeeded in killing it, but after 5 minutes he was really starting to get impatient. And annoyed it wasn't that unbelievable that he'd succeeded at this, surely. He cleared his throat, finally getting their attention. "About my payment," he began. Zorian's eyes abruptly shot open as a sharp pain erupted from his stomach. His whole body convulsed, buckling against the object that fell on him, and suddenly he was wide awake, not a trace of drowsiness in his mind. "Good morning, brother," an annoyingly cheerful voice sounded right on top of him. "Morning, morning, morning." Zorian sighed. He really wished that not all of his restarts began this way. "Good morning to you too, Kiri," he said politely. "Mind getting off me?" She pretended to think about it. "Nope. I think I'll stay like this for a while." "That's unfortunate," he said blandly. "You know you're going back to Academy today, right?" she asked him. "How could I forget?" he responded. "The real question is, do you want to come with me?" Kiriel's eyes expanded comically, like those of a particularly startled cat. "Really? I wouldn't have asked if I wasn't certain," Zorian said. 5 minutes later, Zorian managed to distract an ecstatic Kiriel with an illusionary bird and get her to stop babbling and start packing her luggage. He, on the other hand, was ready. He had learned the basics of deep mental scanning from the Yellow Cavern Guardian's last restart. He was certain that simply being in Scioria wasn't dangerous in itself, and he had a rough plan of where to go from now on. It was time to visit his old academy again. Zorian's previous experiences with riding the train to Scioria alongside Kiriel hadn't been very encouraging. She always started excited and curious, staring intently at the passing landscape and commenting on anything that caught her interest, but that didn't last very long. There just wasn't all that much to see on the route to Scioria, so she quickly got bored of looking through the compartment window and turned to the only other source of entertainment left to her, him. And he was hard-pressed to entertain her throughout the entire ride. That was back when he had been unwilling to use his rising shaping skills to do magic on the train, though. This time he decided he simply didn't care about the risk of discovery. He could find no detection ward on the compartment they were in, and even if they did catch him in the act somehow, they would probably just slap him with a small fine and a lecture. It would be annoying, but better than listening to Curiel whine about being bored for several hours. Plus, this way he got to practice his spellcasting while inhibited by a shaping disruption ward, something he had already been planning to try. That was how Zorian found himself levitating a sphere of water in front of him, a ring of pens and erasers orbiting around it in a diffuse, slowly revolving ring. It was hard, despite the seeming triviality of it all. This wasn't just him stacking a bunch of easy beginner spells to get a neat effect, he was performing an act of unstructured magic, treating the whole thing like a very complicated shaping exercise. Between the complexity of the floating construct and the disruption ward throwing off his shaping skills, he was really struggling to maintain control over the sphere and its satellites. He was pretty sure this was his absolute limit in terms of mana shaping skills, so he should probably make a frog. Curiel challenged. Zorian gave Curiel an annoyed look. She grinned at him, confident that she had won their little game. That she had finally found his limit. He did not deliberately set out to make the complex thing floating in front of him. After all, it had started out as a much smaller sphere with a mere 2 pens circling around it, and Zorian had fully intended for it to stay that way until Curiel started challenging him to make it more difficult. After he emptied the entire contents of his water bottle and used up all of the pens and erasers they both had in their possessions, he was certain she would have had to concede his victory. He broke eye contact with her and focused on the floating construct in front of him. Trying to shape the floating water into anything other than the sphere it was now would be insanely hard. Telekinetically controlling water was far, far harder than doing the same with solid objects, and he would be hard-pressed to sculpt it into complex shapes even if he was outside of a disruption ward and had no ring of small objects to serve as an additional distraction. But he'd be damned if he was just going to roll over and admit defeat to his little sister just because of that. Over the next 15 minutes, he slowly shaped the blob of water into a sculpture of a frog, as detailed and convincing as he could manage it. In other words, not very. He did have a burst of inspiration halfway through, though, and decided to depict the frog monster he saved the Yellow Cavern Guardians from in the previous restart instead of a normal one. Unfortunately, Curiel didn't think much of his efforts. "That's a pretty weird frog," she declared. "It's a yellow cavern devil frog," said Zorian, shamelessly making things up. He had no idea what that monster was called, or if it even had an official name to begin with. Huge, vicious things with a penchant for eating little girls. "That's stupid. You're just making things up," she accused. "Just admit you lost." "Bah, you asked for a frog and I made one. It's not my fault you are not knowledgeable enough in the diverse and fascinating world of magical amphibians. Let me put this away and then I'll tell you about Sumrak the mage and the story of how he saved a secret society of mages from one of the aforementioned devil frogs." Before Curiel could complain too much, Zorian hurriedly set about dismantling the construct in front of him before his rapidly degrading control unraveled completely, letting the pens and erasers float down on the empty seat beside him and pouring the water back into its bottle. That done, he launched into a somewhat modified account of his battle against the frog monster. Well, okay, heavily modified. In Zorian's story, the Yellow Cavern Guardians were a group of reclusive human mages that lived in the far north, practicing spider magic, and the adventurer Sumrak confronted the frog monster head-on with his awesome magical might instead of resorting to traps and subterfuge. It made for a more impressive story that way. Curiel seemed skeptical of the story at first, but when Zorian started using detailed illusions to demonstrate the events he was talking about, her suspiciousness melted away and she paid rapt attention to the story. Zorian didn't know whether to be amused or outraged that she was so entranced by the illusions. They were not quite easy, but nothing special either. The floating ball of water and school supplies he had made earlier on her prompting had taken much more skill and effort to create. He was tempted to chalk it up to her ignorance of what a true display of magical expertise looked like, but he suspected that even if she knew how to judge the difficulty properly, she still likely wouldn't have cared. He had noticed during previous restarts that she loved illusionism the most out of the magical disciplines he had shown her. Maybe it appealed to her inner artist. The train announcer declared that they were arriving to Corsa, forcing Zorian to cut the story short just before Sumrak succeeded in fighting his way through the devil frog's innumerable spawn and confronted the monster in the cavernous home to which it had cravenly fled when it lost its last bout with the adventuring mage. And of course Kiriel was having none of that. She was fine with waiting while people were streaming into the train and looking into compartments to find a seat, but with everyone now settled down and the train moving again, she demanded he continue with the story. The problem was that Ivory had decided to join them in the compartment in the meantime, and Zorian felt just a tiny bit apprehensive about showcasing his abilities in front of her. An apprehension that Kiriel didn't empathize with in the slightest. "You can't stop now, not when the story is so near the ending," she complained. "Well, so long as I refrain from using my visual aids," tried Zorian. "No," Kiriel pleaded. "That was the best part of the story." Zorian threw a significant glance towards Ivory, hoping that Kiriel would take the message. She did, sort of, though she didn't react to the information the way he hoped she would. "Oh come on, the nice lady won't snitch on you for doing magic in the train," Kiriel declared out loud. She then turned towards the startled Ivory and gave her the most soulful puppy eyes look she could muster. "You wouldn't do that, would you?" Ivory mumbled, fidgeting uncomfortably in her seat. "What? Though the train had countermeasures to stop spellcasting." "It does?" asked Kiriel, surprised. "It does," Zorian confirmed. "No point in playing dumb now. They just disrupt spellcasting though, not make it impossible. You can work around it if you're good enough." "And you're that good?" Ivory asked uncertainly. Zorian shrugged, offering no other response. To Kiriel's delight, he then proceeded to finish the story he had been telling, pretty illusions included. He noticed that Ivory had set aside her book to listen as well. She also tried to discreetly cast a few simple spells when she thought he wasn't looking, and then frowned when she failed to overcome the disruption ward. She was probably just curious about the level of skill needed to overcome the ward. He thought about scanning her surface thoughts to find out what she was thinking, but decided not to after giving it some thought. The risk of getting caught in the act was minimal, since Mind Like Fire had taught him how to stealthily test for presence of mental defenses, but getting into the habit of casually invading the minds of everyone around him struck him as a bad idea. He left Ivory to her experiment and focused back to Kiriel and the story he was telling. Once he was done with the story, Ivory promptly struck up a conversation with the two of them. She admitted that she didn't care much about the story itself, especially since she only caught the tail end of it, but she was very impressed by his ability to overcome the train's wards. Especially once she learned he was only starting his third year at the academy. Eventually they arrived in Scioria, however, and went their separate ways. Before they said their goodbyes, however, Ivory nervously told him to drop by the library sometime in the next week in order to discuss something. Well, whatever he had intended to raid the library for more spells in this restart anyway, he might as well see what she wanted from him while he was at it. "I think she likes you," Kiriel said when they were alone. "Nah, she's head over heels for Fortov," said Zorian. "What?" Kiriel asked, baffled. "Her and Fortov?" "No way." "Well, I didn't say they're together," Zorian clarified. "Just that she has a crush on him." "How do you know that?" Kiriel asked suspiciously. "Ancient magical secrets," tried Zorian. Kiriel gave him a deadpan look. Fine, I'll tell you later, when we arrive at our new lodgings." It's not something we should discuss out in the open. Even as he conversed with his little sister, Zorian paid attention to what his mind sense was telling him while they moved through the crowds. Even if he was being targeted by someone shielded from mental detection, the absence of a mind in someone would be a huge red flag on its own. He detected no hostile intentions directed at either of them, though, and none of the suspicious people he encountered were invisible to his mind sense. After 10 minutes, he breathed a sigh of relief. His fears of walking into a trap with his little sister in tow appeared to have been unfounded. He knew it would rain later on, but he could ward against the rain easily enough. Perhaps a little sightseeing around the city to quench Kiriel's curiosity a little. "Hey," Zorian said, attracting Kiriel's attention. "Do you want to visit the main plaza of the city? They have a pretty nice fountain there that I like to watch sometimes." She said yes, of course. He needn't have even asked. It had been more than 4 years since Zorian had started looping, and a lot of things had happened in that period. Keeping track of it all was a major challenge, despite his mage training and his own excellent memory. Being absent from Scioria for nearly a year and a half in order to escape Red Robe's scrutiny certainly didn't help in this regard, and many of the minor details and specifics of how a normal restart was supposed to go had faded from his mind during his long absence. It should not be very surprising, then, that he'd totally forgotten what happened the last time he tried to reach the fountain at the beginning of a restart. After all, he hadn't tried it since that very first, fateful restart that got him included into the time loop. Thus, when the two of them finally stumbled upon the swarm of cephalic rats blocking their path, Zorian was caught just as off guard by it as he was the previous time. He wasn't as defenseless as he was back then, though, and he nearly burned them all to a crisp before he stopped himself. He was pretty sure that him killing the swarm would put him on the invaders' radar, and therefore on Red Robe's radar as well, so the smartest move would be to simply retreat like he did back in his first restart. He felt the swarm testing his mental defenses and responded by strengthening his defenses and striking back. The attack stopped, but his counterattack did very little to the collective mind of the swarm. The group mind was thoroughly unshielded, probably because any mental shell would interfere with its internal telepathic network, but his counterattack merely knocked out a couple of individual rats instead of doing any significant damage. He wondered. He felt a spike of terror from Kiriel as she finally realized what she was looking at, and realized he really shouldn't be playing around with these things. He was probably immune to anything they may dish out, but she wasn't. He fired off a weak flamethrower at the closest part of the swarm to make them back off a little and then immediately turned around, grabbed Kiriel and fled. The rats didn't follow, much like how they didn't follow him the first time he encountered them. They probably didn't want to attract attention any more than he did, though that did raise the question of what the hell they were doing blocking off one of Scioria's major roads in broad daylight. Something to look into eventually. While they ran, he idly marveled about how fortunate it was that he'd never replicated that first meeting with the cephalic rats before he had met the Urania. They would have undoubtedly read his mind, and there was a good chance they would have found out about the time loop from his thoughts. Even if they dismissed the time travel stuff as delusion, they would have definitely been interested in him knowing about the invasion. Can we still go see the fountain?" Kiriel asked once they had retreated sufficiently and she'd had a chance to catch her breath and calm down. "Yeah, I know an alternative route," said Zorian, pointing towards a nearby park. Wait, hadn't he tried that in the first restart and encountered some kind of problem? He was pretty sure he had. What kind of, oh? The bicycle girl. He had totally forgotten about her. Oh well, that wasn't really a problem. He would just get her bicycle out of the water really quickly and they would be on their way. Kiriel got unusually quiet when they encountered the little crying girl and hung back while he talked to her. He got the girl's bike out of the creek with trivial ease, simply placing his hand over the bridge and whiling the bike to rise into his grasp. It took more time to calm the girl down a little and get her to tell him what she was upset about than it did to actually retrieve it. He used a couple of spells to dry the bike off and clean all the grime that had accumulated on it, simply because he could and saw no reason not to. He suspected the bike was cleaner now than it was before it had fallen into the creek. "There," said Zorian proudly. Your bike is clean, intact and out of the creek. You can stop crying now, okay? Okay, she sniffed, rubbing her eyes. Thank you. Don't mention it, Zorian said. Well, we should get going now, so take care. I think it's going to rain soon, so you should probably head home as well. Come on brother, don't be mean. We can't just leave her here, protested Kiriel suddenly. We should get her home ourselves, just to be sure. He's not mean, the other little girl protested, suddenly snapping out of her daze. And I can find my way home just fine. I'm not stupid. Oh, he liked this kid. It wasn't often that someone defended him in preference to Kiriel. Well. I'm glad that someone is not automatically assuming the worst of me, said Zorian, giving a sideways glance towards Kiriel. She rolled her eyes at him. I am sure that Kiriel didn't mean anything like that, though she was just worried for you, since you still looked pretty upset. I only got the bike yesterday and mother told me to be careful with it because they couldn't afford a new one and I. Hey, it's alright, said Zorian quickly, interrupting her story. She looked like she was going to cry again. You got it back. All's well that ends well. But maybe we really should accompany you home, at least until you calm down a little. Yeah. Kiriel piped in. We can talk on the way and get to know each other. I just moved in here and it would be nice to have a friend my age. What's your name anyway? I'm Kiriel and this guy here that got your bike out of the river is my brother Zorian. Nachka, she said. But, I don't want to make you late. We were just going to see the fountain, nothing really important, Kiriel waved her off. We can do that any time. Come on, show us where you live. The walk to Nachka's house was a short one. She lived pretty close to the park, which was the reason her parents had let her go there all alone. Still pretty strange for parents to be so hands-off about their child's whereabouts, but Zorian's parents were the same with him so he didn't pry. He didn't say much of anything really, but that was okay because Kiriel talked plenty enough for both of them. Nachka herself was shy and nervous, constantly watching her surroundings and jumping at every unusual sound, but she did warm up to Kiriel by the time they had reached her house. She was 8, a year younger than Kiriel, and was also fairly new to Scioria. Her family had arrived into the city a couple of months ago, and she didn't have any friends her age either. Great. He was pretty sure he knew where this was going. Zorian once again tried to disengage from the whole situation once they got Nachka to her destination, but failed. Nachka's mother saw them arriving and insisted they come inside, and he didn't want to be impolite. He figured the woman had every right to be curious about a couple of strangers walking around with her daughter in tow, so they should at least allay her fears a little before leaving. Nachka hurriedly gave her an account of the situation the moment they were inside, though in her story the bike didn't end up in the creek, but was instead stuck in a rope trap that happened to be in the park for some reason. Nachka kind of glossed over that part and moved on to Zorian helping her get it down from the tree. Yeah, Nachka was a terrible liar. Based on the way her mother was looking at her when she finished her story, Zorian was betting that she would be getting the real story out of Nachka the moment Zorian and Kiriel left the house. Nachka's mother, who Zorian learned was named Ray, was honestly a little scary to Zorian. She didn't look frightening. She had the same jet black hair and dark brown eyes that Nachka did, and the stature and dress of an average housewife, but it took only 5 minutes for Zorian to decide there was more to her. Her movements were all fluid and precise, she never stuttered or wavered when she spoke, her gaze was frighteningly intense, and she gave off an air of absolute confidence and composure. Frankly, if he had been alone he would have left the place in a hurry, but Kiriel didn't seem nearly as intimidated by the woman and insisted on telling her new friend stories. Such as the one of how they stumbled upon her in the first place. Ah yes, the strange brain rats, Ray said when Kiriel told them about their encounter with the cephalic rats. I've seen a few hanging around the house, but never in such numbers. Disgusting things. Zorian frowned. Why were the cephalic rats hanging around their house? You should be careful, he told her. They're called cephalic rats and they can read your mind, possibly even memories if left unmolested long enough. Good thing I kill them when I find them, then, Ray said. Yes, but don't think that makes you totally safe, Zorian said. They're a telepathic hive mind, so killing one rat will not erase the information it has gathered on you. What one cephalic rat knows, they all know. I really think you should report this to the city authorities and have them hunt the swarm down, but it's your choice in the end. I see, Ray said after staring at him for a few seconds. I'll talk to my husband about your advice and we'll see what we can do. I must say, you are surprisingly well informed for a 15-year-old, Mr. Kaczynski. Brother is really smart, said Kiriel. Oh hush, you flatterer. Right, thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Satchel, but our landlord is expecting us and we really should get going, Zorian said, rising from his seat and motioning for Kiriel to do the same. From what Ray had said earlier, her husband was going to come home from work soon, and he'd rather not get stuck in another round of explanations. The rain is rather heavy, though, Ray said, glancing through the window next to her. You should at least wait for the weather to get better before you go. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem like it'll happen for quite some time, said Zorian. But that's okay, because I can just teleport myself and Kiriel close to our destination and shield us from the rain for the short while we'll be caught in it. Can Kiriel come over to play with me sometime? Asked Nachka. Yeah. Sure, said Zorian. Yes, he was pretty sure Kiriel would be angry if he said no. Though he really didn't want Kiriel in an area infested with cephalic rats. Zorian and Kiriel said their goodbyes and left in the direction of Amaya's house. The next day, Zorian woke up early and told Amaya he was going to the library, though in truth he did no such thing. Instead, he teleported himself to Nyazov Dveri, where he proceeded to gather crystallized mana. By now he had mapped large portions of the local underworld, and as such couldn't actually pick up every piece of crystallized mana within a single day. He would need another 2 or 3 days to clean the place up properly. Oh, and he was also hitting the limits of his memory. It seemed he had outright forgotten about some of the minor resource locations, and it took him a while to track down others. Annoying. He wondered what his previous self would say if he knew that in the future he would have so much wealth within reach that he would literally forget about some of it. Probably something rude. He had only been back at Amaya's place for half an hour or so before Taven came to speak with him. Let me guess, you want me to go into the sewers with you to recover a watch from a bunch of giant spiders, Zorian guessed. What? No, I decided not to bother with that job since more lucrative ones have popped up lately, said Taven. She gave him a strange look. How the hell do you know about that, anyway? I told maybe 2 people I was even interested in that job. Rather than try to trick her with some poor excuse, he decided to simply ignore her question and ask his own. If you're not here for that, why are you here, Taven? You don't exactly have a habit of visiting me for the hell of it. Taven protested that she totally did visit him for the hell of it, and vehemently denied that she had come to ask him for a favor. It was an opportunity, she insisted, an opportunity to earn big money and fame, if only he would cooperate with her. Well, if nothing else, her new scheme was a lot more tempting than her old one. Long story short, the monster incursions he read about in the newspapers had started way earlier than Zorian had expected they would. There were a couple of bad ones on the very first day of the restart. A young couple had been heavily injured and a huge abyssal centipede crawled out of the sewers in the middle of a crowded street, and a restaurant had to be evacuated when a huge yellow ooze broke into the wine cellar and started consuming everything in sight. Things got worse overnight, and there were a number of fatalities while Zorian had been busy picking up crystallized mana in Nyazov Dveri, causing the city to enact some emergency measures. One of these was issuing large bounties on confirmed monster kills and encouraging various dungeon delvers and mercenary groups to go as deep into Sioria's dungeon as they dared. The idea was to cull the monster population before they could reach the surface. As far as Taven was concerned, this was exactly what she had been waiting for. Already frustrated with the lack of chances to prove her worth, she was eager to take advantage of this new development to make a name for herself by aggressively pursuing bounties and putting down as many dungeon denizens as she could find. The problem was that her group was too small for her ambitions. 3 people do not make a proper hunting party. I'm surprised you came to me with this, said Zorian. This sounds like it requires decent combat skills, and I am only a 3rd year. Surely some of your peers would have been better for this. Well, the thing is, I'm not the only one recruiting, and many of the other recruiters are a lot more prestigious and well-known than little old me. It should get easier once I start getting results, but that could be too late and I can't afford to be too picky right now. Can't afford to be picky, huh? Said Zorian flatly. Before the time loop, that phrase right there would have caused him to refuse her offer out of spite. He hated being thought of as second best, never mind a last resort. But years in the time loop had tempered his ego, and he could admit to himself that Taven's judgment was spot on considering the information she had on him. Okay, bad choice of words, admitted Taven. But as you said yourself, you're only a 3rd year. How good are you at combat magic? Do you think you could pull your own weight in a team as you are now? How much should he reveal here? Taven could be shockingly oblivious about some things, but she would definitely not ignore him being way stronger than he had any right being. And she was one of the few people who knew his pre-time loop self well enough to make such a judgment call with a fair amount of certainty. And for that matter, did he even want to join Taven's group? It sounded like a huge time sink, and he had so many other things vying for his attention. Maybe it would be better if he were to pretend he was too weak and inexperienced to help her. Oh, to hell with it, he'd give it a chance this time. If nothing else, it would give him a ready-made excuse for a lot of things he intended to do in this restart. Absolutely. I have been in the dungeon before, he admitted. I have a decent repertoire of combat spells and I'm confident that I won't freeze on the first sign of danger. The biggest problem is my mana reserves at maximum. I can only cast about 20 magic missiles in a row. And that's after I increased my reserves through constant use. I'm pretty average in terms of mana reserves magnitude. Taven stared at him for a few seconds, incredulous. You've been in the dungeon before? She finally asked. I'm surprised you got permission for that. The academy sure didn't want to give me one before I was well into my 4th year. I didn't say anything about asking permission, said Zorian. Zorian. What, like you've never done anything like that? Challenged Zorian. Well, maybe once or twice, Taven admitted. But it doesn't sound like this was an occasional occurrence for you. Getting your mana reserves that high must have involved some pretty intense practice, considering where you started from. That sounds pretty dangerous. Sometimes a man has to take chances, Zorian quoted in Taven's voice. I do believe you're the one who told me that, Taven. I was talking about romance and you know it, she protested. Why couldn't you take my advice about that instead? I did take your advice, thought Zorian sourly to himself. I got laughed in my face for my trouble. Why are you lecturing me about this? You should be overjoyed your desperate ploy had worked, he said instead. Do you want me in your damn team or not? I do. Taven quickly assured him. She pulled out a sheet of paper from her bag and set it down on the table in front of him. I guess you're right, this isn't really important right now. Why don't you just fill out this membership form and I'll give you a rundown of what I had planned for tomorrow. Over the next couple of days Zorian went on regular forays into Sayoria's underworld with Taven, Yurik and Oren. He quickly realized that his combat skills weren't really the most valuable thing he brought to the whole operation. The combined might of Taven and her 2 old teammates was usually enough to destroy any threat they encountered, with Zorian only called to fight when one of those 3 ended up low on mana and needed to rest for a while. No, the biggest benefits he brought to the table were a detailed map of a huge chunk of Sayoria's underworld, courtesy of the Matriarch's last message, and a decent proficiency in divination that allowed him to scout the areas in front of them and track down any specific target they were pursuing. Without him there to direct the rest of the group, they would have probably spent most of their time wandering aimlessly in search of something to fight. Those three were dangerously over-specialized for direct combat in Zorian's opinion. While down in the dungeon, he took the opportunity to scout the invaders' underground bases that he was aware of, trying to see how they were dealing with this kind of increased activity and scrutiny of Cyoria's underworld. Taven's group was far from the only one that had tried to cash in on the bounties the city was offering, and more groups were expected to get involved soon. What he found was that the invaders had retreated somewhat, abandoning several of their more exposed bases completely and leaving only token forces in many others. That was bound to have a very negative impact on the execution of the invasion. When he wasn't hunting down dungeon denizens with Taven, he was tending to the multitude of his other plans and obligations. He finished harvesting crystallized mana under Nyazov Dveri and had started to slowly sell his huge stockpile off to various stores, both in Cyoria and outside. He took Kiriel to see Nachka and stayed around to watch out for any cephalic rats in the area, but thankfully didn't detect any. He ended up meeting Nachka's father, this time a tall, jovial, bearded, muscular fellow named Saw who loved to laugh and talk and was completely unlike his wife, yet still terrifying in his own way. Zorian was half convinced that the workshop Saw insisted on showing him, the one full of hammers and other heavy, dangerous-looking tools, was the man's way of threatening him bodily harm should he hurt his daughter in any way. He also visited the library to see what Ibury wanted from him. To his surprise, he found out that Ibury was interested in getting magical instruction from him. She had been looking to hire someone for additional tutoring outside of the academy, but found most tutors out of her price range, and was hoping a third year like him might be amenable to a spell exchange or something else of that nature. Though the offer was kind of interesting, he had too many things on his plate as it was, so he told her he'd get back to her after the summer festival, if she was still interested. Perhaps in some future restart where he refused Taven's recruitment pitch. And, of course, he still had to attend classes. That was a chore, though not quite as big of a one as he had been expecting. His long absence from Cyoria had made him forget many of the details of how classes were supposed to go, and caused him to view others in a completely new perspective. The constant monster incursions into the city had also had an effect on the academy. Jade was gone from the class, pulled out of the academy by her family for safety concerns. Zack was gone too, of course, and since nobody, except Zorian, knew the real reason for his absence, most people assumed he had been similarly pulled out for safety reasons and sent out of Cyoria. Kirin announced during their first lessons that he was running additional combat practice lessons during evenings, and Ilsa openly encouraged anyone with significant combat ability to join one of the groups culling the monsters, offering special benefits and exceptions to anyone who did so and achieved results. She pointed out Zorian, Briam, Tinami, Naeem and Eston as examples of people in the class who had already done that, thoroughly surprising Zorian. He never would have guessed so many people in his class had decided they're good enough to get themselves involved in that. 2 days later, Capriva would join that list, while Maya and Nairoro were ordered home by their parents until the situation calmed down. With such large changes in class composition and teacher behavior, Zorian's school experience was relatively novel compared to what he remembered of his pre-exile Cyoria days. He was sure it would all get boring and repetitive again after another restart or two, but for now it was bearable. A few more days passed. The number and severity of monster excursions gradually dropped off, and the city stopped behaving like a kicked-over anthill and settled into some semblance of normality. There was still a lot of tension in the air, forays into the dungeon went on still, but things were finally calming down. As such, Zorian started investigating various invaders, cultists and other people related to the invasion that he still remembered from his time with the Cyorian Arania, tracking their movements and activities but launching no attacks for the moment. The furor over the dead mercenaries and monster incursions caused so many changes to the preparations of the invasion that his memories were of limited use, and he didn't want to move until he was reasonably sure he knew when and where to strike. It was peculiar, though even accounting for massive divergences due to Red Robe's removal of Arania, the invaders were still strangely ineffective. Less informed. Before, They seemed to know how to bypass certain wards or evade notice of Sayoria's law enforcement knowledge that they largely lacked in the current restart. He was starting to suspect that Red Robe had a habit of handing over a lot of crucial information to the invaders in previous restarts, even ones where he didn't appear to pay much attention to them afterwards, but that in this one restart he'd chosen not to bother with that at all. Strange. The arrival of Kale at Amaya's place reminded Zorian of their deal to help Kale develop his alchemy in exchange for help with soul magic and other stuff. Unfortunately, there was a problem. Zorian had largely forgotten what the contents of Kale's notebook were over the many restarts he had been absent from Sayoria. Somehow Kale managed to figure out a few things from the disjointed parts of his notes that Zorian still remembered, which helped convince him that Zorian was telling the truth, but he was essentially starting from scratch. Zorian knew he had to find a solution to the forgetting problem if that deal was ever going to work. Without constant reinforcement in every restart, he would forget again, and the amount of information he had to memorize was only going to increase with each restart, making the task harder. And that wasn't just the issue with Kale's potion recipes, either. He had been having trouble remembering the layout of Nyazovdveri resource deposits, some of the minor details of previous restarts, such as his meeting with Nachka, had completely slipped from his memory, and he had a feeling that remembering the vast amount of information about invaders in Sayoria he was currently gathering was going to be a major issue in the future. He needed a better way to remember things, and he needed it soon. He would have to set aside the upcoming weekend to see if he could figure something out. He knocked on Svim's door and dutifully waited for the man to invite him in. "Come in," Svim called out from inside, and Zorian quickly entered the man's office and sat down when instructed to do so. "Show me your basic 3, Svim ordered. Zorian did so silently, efficiently, and without complaint. He had decided before coming here that he would try and see how long it would take for Svim to get unnerved by him meeting all of his demands without any issue or complaint. It was a long-term project. Of course he didn't really think he could baffle the infuriating man in this particular restart, but he was determined to see it through. He would practice whatever stupid exercise Svim threw at him every single day, restart after restart, until he got them right. Until he got them all right, if he was forced to. The man had to run out of shaping exercises at some point, right? Svim threw a marble at him. Zorian moved his head lightly to the left, moving out of the marble's flight path without ever meeting the man's eyes. Another 2 marbles flew at him, but the result was exactly the same. "Close your eyes," Svim ordered. Zorian did. He still dodged every marble Svim threw at him. A cloud of diffuse mana scattered around him as a detection field. Svim did not react, unfazed by his improbable skill, but neither did Zorian. "You can open your eyes again. Here's a box of marbles," said Svim, reaching beneath his desk to pick up a large bowl full of hated spheres of glass. They came in a wide variety of sizes, and Zorian was silently thankful that Svim only ever threw the small ones at him. Some of the big ones looked like they could knock a man unconscious if they connected. "Levitate as many as you can. Hurry up, we haven't got all day." Zorian levitated every single marble in the bowl, but alas he was too slow. Or at least Svim thought so, anyway. He made Zorian lift and lower the entire mass of marbles over and over again, wasting an entire hour. Zorian said nothing though, doing his best to meet Svim's unreasonable demands. Levitating them like that in a giant disorganized lump is unsightly. Make it a proper sphere. A ring now. A pyramid. That doesn't look like a pyramid to me. Do you need to have your glasses checked, Mr. Kaczynski? Yes, better. But slow, you must be faster. Much faster. Start over from the sphere again. 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 Zorian made the mass of marbles flow from one shape to another as fast as he could, but eventually a disaster struck. He lost control of the exercise and the entire mass went crashing down onto the table. Zorian winced as the marbles bounced off the table, making a huge racket and scattering all over Svim's office, his mask of cool detachment breaking for a moment. Damn it. Several seconds passed in the aftermath as Zorian and Svim stared at each other impassively. "Well?" asked Svim curiously. "What are you waiting for, Mr. Kaczynski? Hurry up and gather the marbles into the bowl so we can continue where we left off." "Yes, sir," said Zorian, unable to keep a note of sourness out of his voice. "I'll be right on it." It was official, he really hated marbles. Zorian stared at his tormentor in silence, as relaxed and impassive as one could be when faced with such a pitiless, unreasonable man. Svim stared back at him, his face a picture of unshakable, effortless composure that made Zorian's best efforts at stoicism appear laughable in comparison. Still, he wouldn't break. He didn't break. He had, eventually, met every ridiculous demand Svim had given him and had never blown up at the man even once. Of course, that hadn't impressed the man any, even when he'd demonstrated insanely good shaping skills for a third-year student, but he'd expected as much. They continued staring at each other in silence for several seconds. That, Svim finally decided, was terrible. "You are inflexible, slow, yet paradoxically impatient. I see in you a tendency to overreach, Mr. Kaczynski, moving on to advanced fields of study without a healthy foundation to back it up. A common problem with many of your fellow mages, true, but everyone else is doing it, was never a valid excuse for anything. We will have to work on that before we tackle anything more substantial." "Of course, sir," Zorian said calmly. "I'll be sure to practice everything you've shown me back at home." "Good. I expect a better performance on our second session," said Svim, leaning back in his chair before making a shooing motion with his hand. "You are dismissed." Zorian made a solemn nod, slowly rose from his chair and then fled the office as fast as he could without making it obvious he was in a hurry to leave. Only when he shut the door and put some distance from the room did he let himself relax. That could have ended up badly. Very, very badly. He knew he'd be taking a risk when he tried to read Svim's mind, but the man had aggravated him so much that he couldn't help himself. Besides, what were the chances of Svim deciding to shield his mind for a meeting with one of his students? Pretty good, apparently, because Zorian encountered a powerful mental shield when he tried to read his thoughts. He withdrew immediately, terrified that his telepathic probe had been noticed by the man, but whatever defenses Svim had apparently gave the man too little feedback to notice Zorian's relatively delicate attack. Well, that or he did notice but decided not to say anything, but that seemed very unlikely. If that were the case, he would have at least made a snide comment or two about how sloppy Zorian's attempt was, even if he wasn't at all bothered by the attempt itself. It was very interesting that Svim had bothered shielding his mind for their meeting, though. Was Svim one of those mages who kept their mind shielded at all times, or did he somehow know about Zorian's talents? There were a lot of possibilities. Zorian made a mental note to barge into the man's office unannounced at some point in the next week, just to see if Svim had his mind shielded. Even when not expecting Zorian to arrive. His thoughts were still preoccupied with Svim when he arrived back home, at which point the realization that he could sense the minds of Nachka and her mother in the house pushed the topic of his so-called mentor out of his mind. That was unexpected. There had been no plans for them to visit, as far as he knew. He entered the house and made a beeline towards the kitchen, where he could sense Amaya and Ray were currently situated, and found them seated around the kitchen table, gossiping over some cookies and plum brandy. Well, whatever. After exchanging greetings, he tried to ask Ray about her reasons for coming unannounced without sounding rude and accusing. He didn't quite succeed. If the dirty look Amaya shot him was any indication, but Ray herself didn't seem to mind. "Nachka was being impatient about your next visit, so I decided to take her to Kiriel instead," she explained. "Besides, it is not fair to make you spend your time on bringing your sister over to my home. You are a student of magic, with many additional obligations aside, I'm told, and I am but a simple housewife with plenty of free time." Simple housewife, right. If she really was what she claimed to be, he wouldn't do anything crazy, but he'd be shocked. It was possible, but she was too confident and emotionally composed to be some ordinary housewife. For myself, I have no complaint about Nachka coming here from time to time, Amaya piped in. So you need not worry about any complaint from me. I see, Zorian said slowly. He looked at Ray, and found her unflinchingly meeting his gaze. Though his empathy detected no hostile intent and she didn't do anything overtly threatening, he found her vaguely unsettling. It was her body language, he realized. Though her posture was relaxed, she did not fidget or move at all. Making a snap decision, Zorian decided to take a risk for the second time in a day and dived into her surface thoughts. He didn't want to get too comfortable with violating the mental sanctity of people around him, but if a person looked like a threat, he felt it was justified. And Ray definitely looked suspicious to him right now. Ree's mind was not shielded, and she gave no indication that she detected his intrusion. That said, he didn't get anything worthwhile out of it. She was not feeling very introspective at the moment, nor thinking any incriminating thoughts. Mostly, she seemed to be studying him, even as he was doing the same to her. Much like Zorian could tell she was not a normal housewife, she too seemed aware that he was anything but a normal student. He decided to get her talking about her background and current situation, hopefully guiding her thoughts down the path that would reveal what her deal was. Besides, Amaya seemed to be getting more and more uncomfortable with their silent stare-down, so if nothing else he should break the silence to calm her down a little. You know, I just realized I never did ask you why you and your family moved into Scioria, said Zorian. I bet it's a fascinating story. Over the next half an hour, Zorian spoke with Ray about her life and recent history, with Amaya occasionally jumping in with her opinion. Despite his efforts, Zorian failed to uncover any deep secret from Ree's thoughts. Her mind was too focused on what she was saying, with little in the way of internal musings or stray thoughts. The only thing Zorian could tell with certainty was that she hadn't lied even once while talking to him. Her story about her family moving from a small rural town to Scioria out of simple desire for a better life in the big city was something she honestly believed in, rather than some cliched cover story. Her husband wanted a better paying job he could not get in their old home. Ray wanted to get away from their rather unpleasant neighbors who were spreading nasty rumors about her whenever they could get away with it, and they were both unhappy with the poor state of the local school and wanted better for Nachka. So they moved. Simple as that. Currently they were still in the process of setting up in Scioria, and were thus having some money problems, but Ray seemed unconcerned about that, claiming it to be a temporary issue. His mind reading did pick up on two interesting things. First, Ray had ridiculously good hearing. Throughout the entire conversation, she was somehow picking up on the conversation Kiriel and Nachka were having in another part of the house, separated from the kitchen by a corridor and two closed doors. Zorian himself could not hear a thing from the two girls, no matter how hard he strained his ears. Secondly, while Ray did not know he was reading her mind, she was pretty good at figuring out people's moods and motives the old-fashioned way. She realized pretty quickly he was suspicious of her and trying to interrogate her. And she found it amusing. Very, very amusing. Eventually, Zorian was forced to admit defeat, withdrawing from Ree's mind and excusing himself so he could leave. At the very least he was mollified that Ray did not seem to have any sinister plan for him and Kiriel, which was really all he cared about in regards to her. She could keep her secrets, so long as they didn't come back to haunt him later. Then again, he had the feeling that Kale's willingness to accept his explanation about the time loop came from greed. He was sure that Kale saw the time loop less as a terrifying anomaly and more as a fantastic opportunity that could catapult his skills and knowledge immensely if he played his cards right, and that doubtlessly influenced how inclined he was to accept Zorian's story as truthful. Case in point. "Ah, you're here," Kale greeted him. "Did you get the ingredients I asked of you?" "Yup," said Zorian, reaching into his bag and withdrawing a wooden box full of alchemical ingredients. "There were no problems?" Kale asked, accepting the box and promptly opening it to examine the contents. He pulled out one of the bottles from the box, the one full of inky black liquid, and brought it towards the light to check something. "No. The shopkeeper looked at me strangely for buying so many expensive ingredients, but said nothing in the end." It would still probably be smart to buy the next batch from some other shop, though. Probably, agreed Kale, putting the bottle back and snapping the box shut. There was no offer of reimbursing Zorian for his expenses. One of the first demands Kale had of Zorian once he decided the time loop thing had something to it was for Zorian to finance his experiments to the best of his ability. He understood Kale's demand for what it was not just a way for the boy to secure more funding, but also a challenge for Zorian to prove he believed what he was saying. After all, if he really believed in his own time loop story, he wouldn't care at all about spending his money like that, would he? How often do you think you'll be able to buy more? He asked. Well, I hesitate to say, as often as you need me to, since I'm sure you can burn through any amount of money I have if you go wild, but I'm pretty loaded right now. Thanks to the time loop I found a very time-efficient way to extract a great deal of crystallized mana from Nyazov Dveri's underworld, and selling that has given me a huge amount of money to spend, Zorian explained. So 2 or 3 boxes like that a day if I had to. Maybe more, but I really think that would be a bad idea, since I don't think I'd be able to avoid unwelcome attention if I started buying so much expensive stuff. I see, Kale said slowly, clearly more than a little surprised at the information. That's a lot of money. Out of curiosity, why did you go to the trouble to get so much? Funds for your own experiments? Partially, said Zorian. It certainly makes things a lot easier when you can throw around money like it's nothing. Saves time. And yes, I know it's strange for that to be a concern when you're stuck in an ever-repeating time loop. And the other part? Greed, I guess, Zorian admitted. When I finally break out of the time loop I kind of want to have all my monetary concerns taken care of. Probably not the best use of my time but dash. Don't worry, I understand you completely, said Kale, smiling slightly. I probably wouldn't have been able to resist doing so myself. In fact, I probably would have done it much sooner, even with the threat of other time travelers and the presence of more pressing problems you're dealing with. So many problems in my life would have disappeared if I had 1,000,000 pieces or so. Well, you are an alchemist, Zorian said. Your profession has always been very expensive to practice, unless you were one of those alchemists who were willing to limit themselves to components they could grow and personally harvest in the wilderness. It makes perfect sense that you'd want to get rich if given a chance. Perhaps. I don't think I'd be anywhere near as efficient about it as you are, though. Well, not without resorting to theft. The thought of looking for crystallized mana would have never occurred to me. What's so valuable about it that people are willing to pay so much? Zorian gave Kale a curious look. It's a bit strange to hear an alchemist ask that. I'm pretty sure that powdered crystallized mana is an important potion ingredient. Not in the kind of potions I'm making, Kale said, shaking his head. Ah, so these are the crystals the new trains use for fuel, said Kale. Yes, Zorian confirmed. I heard that use of crystallized mana as train fuel is really driving the prices of it upwards lately, got a bunch of people worried. Very convenient for me, though. Of course I've looked into it, Zorian scoffed. It's impossible. Personal mana loses its affinity with its maker rapidly once expended, becoming indistinguishable from ambient mana in a matter of minutes. Ah. Indeed. What about alchemical solutions? Is there a potion that increases your mana regeneration, gives you a momentary mana boost or something like that? I doubt it. I think we would have all heard about such a potion if it was at all available. But it's possible, I suppose, especially if it has some serious drawbacks that curtails its use. You should probably ask Lukav about that. If anyone knows how to answer that question definitively, it's him, Kale said. He squirmed uncomfortably. And since we're on the topic of Lukav, I have a bit of a personal request. I'm listening, Zorian said curiously. Okay, Kale began. When I gave you that list of people to consult with in regards to soul magic, I did not exactly give you a list of strangers. We weren't best friends, but I knew these people. We had history between us, we met sometimes to exchange news and the like. To find out that someone had been going around, kidnapping and killing them, was very upsetting to me. Zorian winced. Now that it was pointed out to him, he had been really rather callous when he told Kale of the disappearances in Nyazov Dveri, hadn't he? This wasn't just another disquieting mystery to Kale, but an outright attack on him and his acquaintances. I'm not angry at you, Kale hurriedly added. I realize you already have a lot on your plate, and that staying alive and figuring out what is behind the time loop takes precedence over everything else. However, I would really appreciate it if you looked into these killers and figured out a way to stop them for good. Of course, Zorian immediately agreed. I had fully intended to do so anyway. I simply delayed that investigation until I had taken care of more pressing problems and gotten somewhat better at magical combat. Besides, he had figured that investigating the invasion forces here in Scioria would automatically bring him closer to solving that particular mystery. The two were clearly connected somehow, perhaps even two different fronts of the exact same operation. I see. That takes a load off my chest, Kale said, exhaling heavily. If there is anything I can do to help you with this, just let me know. I'm still in the process of asking around, but I think I can get my hands on a couple of truth potion recipes. I already have my own interrogation magic, but I suppose having more options to choose from never hurts, Zorian said. Truthfully, truth potions might actually be more effective than what he had in mind, at least at the current stage of the investigation, but he really needed to develop his ability to sift through people's memories, so he was reluctant to use them. Keep in mind that Lukav already knows how to make a truth potion, so if your talks fall through I can just teleport you to his village so you can have a friendly chat with him. Perhaps he is willing to share. He knows how to do that. Sneaky bastard was holding out on me, Kale grumbled. Still, that does remind me that Lukav is far from being a helpless victim and neither is his priest friend. It might be a good idea to involve them in the investigation. They might be perfectly capable of taking the killers down on their own if you provide him with sufficient information. Now there was an idea. It would be hard to secure a Lanix cooperation without coming clean about absolutely everything, but the benefits could be immense. He would have to seriously consider it when he started to seriously tackle the problem of Ayaska Manor and disappearances around Nyazov Dveri. Well, said Kale after a few seconds of silence, unlocking one of the drawers attached to his work desk and withdrawing a cheap, featureless notebook out of it. With that out of the way, I'd like to discuss another unpleasant topic with you, your soul marker. Zorian straightened his back a little, suddenly alert. Truthfully, when he had told Kale about the soul marker and allowed the Morlock boy to perform a scan of his soul, he had not expected much. Kale may have been a necromancer, but he was very much an amateur one. Still, he figured it wouldn't hurt to put some trust in the other boy. Both Lukav and Alanik were rather narrowly specialized when it came to their soul magic expertise, and it was entirely possible that they had missed something that a full-blown necromancer, even a novice one, would find obvious. It seemed that was indeed the case. What is it? He asked with barely hidden excitement. Kale sighed and pressed the notebook into Zorian's hand. Leafing through it, however, Zorian realized he didn't understand anything in it. It was full of unfamiliar diagrams and alien jargon, interspersed with brief paragraphs that meant nothing to one who lacked sufficient context to understand them. He shot Kale an annoyed look. I'll be blunt, said Kale, ignoring his glare. Your marker shouldn't work. Seeing Zorian's confused expression, he moved to explain. I was immediately suspicious when you described how tightly the markers entwined with your soul. Why would someone make such a deeply embedded marker and then make it a simple unchanging identification stamp like you assumed it was? The desire to make the marker resilient to damage and harder to remove could explain some of it, but it was still excessive. There are less invasive means that would have only failed if the soul was so mangled that the person was effectively dead. Those methods do have a noticeable flaw, though they are a lot easier to copy than what you have rooted in your soul. That, I felt, was key. The marker was designed to foil attempts at copying it to other people. And in order to do that It needed to check up on the host's soul to see whether it has been transplanted to another person, Zorian interrupted. Yes, Kale said. He took the notebook out of Zorian's hands, flipped it to one of the later pages and handed it back to him. Looking at it again, Zorian could tell that the diagram was supposed to be a crude outline of a human's body, several circles, triangles and straight lines drawn over it. Below it was a short paragraph talking about essence channels, feedback nodes and transition barriers. It still didn't mean much to Zorian, but he could tell this time that it was supposed to represent Zorian's soul, the marker attached to it and their interaction to one another. I do not claim to completely understand the marker, Kale said. Or even most of it. It's an awe-inspiring thing, clearly made by a master soul mage. I especially like how it makes itself inconspicuous to casual soul scans. I'm not surprised I never detected it before being informed it was there. Still, there are some things about its functions that are obvious to me, and one of them is that the marker is designed to consult the soul of its host, the core, unchanging part of it, anyway, and alter its identification tag according to what it detects. Transplanting the marker to another person should result in a totally different identification value. But that's clearly not how it works, Zorian protested. Zack and I have the same damn marker. The tracking spell wouldn't have worked otherwise. It's broken, Kale said calmly. Your marker, that is. There are parts of it that are totally inert, either because they do not acknowledge you as its rightful host or because they are missing some critical piece that got lost in the transfer. I'm guessing that at least one of those is supposed to send a signal to the looping mechanism when you die, terminating the loop prematurely. That would neatly explain why you get sent back when Zack dies, but he doesn't experience the same when you end up dead. He has the intact version of the marker, whereas you don't. But the main part of the thing works. In a sense. It does everything it is supposed to, consulting the core of your soul, but for some reason it is still stuck on the same value it had while it was still inside Zack. It's broken, but it's broken in your favor. Ha, said Zorian lamely. What was he supposed to say to that? Honestly? This isn't such a huge surprise. I always suspected that the marker was in some way defective. After all, I highly doubt that its makers intended for someone like me to enter the time loop the way I did. Does this really change anything? Zorian frowned. What was he? Then it hit him. Wait. How did Red Robe end up time looping, then? Yes, that is the question, isn't it? Kale said, his fingers drumming on his work table impatiently. I'm afraid I don't know how to answer that question. But he clearly didn't use the same method you did. Yeah, Zorian agreed. I had strongly suspected that, but I couldn't be sure. Him having some other method of joining the time loop would explain why he never used his own marker to track me down the way I did Zack. He doesn't have the same marker as me and Zack, if he indeed has one at all, so he would have to capture Zack and use him as a key to locate me that way. And if he's indeed a master soul mage like you seem to think, he probably knows you could not possibly have an identical marker as Zack, so there is no reason for him to try that in the first place, Kale said. They bounced theories and ideas off one another for the next half an hour, but it was all just hollow speculation at the moment. They had no way to confirm or discard any of the possibilities. Kale thought that Red Robe was in some way piggy-backing on Zack, either by leaving portions of his mind in Zack the way the Cyaurian Matriarch did with Zorian, or by having some kind of soul link with Zack. Zorian discarded the possibility of a mind package immediately. The logistics of that kind of setup didn't add up. Red Robe was active within hours of the start of the loop, if his quick arrival to the ruins of the Arania colony in that one restart were any indication, and processing a large amount of memories took more than a day. Not to mention that Zack didn't start every restart by going to the same location, so it was questionable how Red Robe would have even gotten a memory package in every restart. No, Red Robe definitely wasn't using memory packages. And really, Zorian didn't think he was linked to Zack's soul either. If he was, he would have checked Zack's soul for additional connections when he'd read his mind and found out there were additional time travelers running around. Instead, he immediately ran off to confront the Arania. The thought of someone being connected to Zack's soul didn't seem to occur to him. Personally, Zorian thought Red Robe did have a marker of some sort. It was entirely possible, he felt, that there was a way for people who knew what they were doing to enter the time loop properly to get their own marker and all. Though that did raise a question about why he didn't just off Zack and go on with his life free of interference. What was so special about Zack? Right. I don't think we're getting anywhere with this, Zorian said. Anything else I should keep in mind? Nothing that Lukav and his priest friend didn't already warn you about. Avoid any magic that could alter your soul substantially. We don't know what caused the marker to get stuck on its current identification value, and there is no telling what will push it off the edge, so take care, said Kale. I was afraid to do that even before now, and for that exact reason too, Zorian said, leaning back on making a deliberately dramatic sigh. Pity, though. I guess my dream of turning that stupid Grey Hunter Silverlake sent me to deal with into my very own familiar or becoming a Grey Hunter shifter is doomed to remain just a dream. Didn't you know? There is a reason why most shifters are made from normal animals, Kale warned him. Being a shifter means you get instincts from the other part of the soul, and magical creatures always have very strong souls. The more magical the creature, the stronger. And they tend to be extremely violent and territorial. With regards to Grey Hunters, I'm fairly certain they don't tolerate even their own kind, much less anything else. Such an attitude would bleed over to you if you became a Grey Hunter shifter. And there is also the matter of inheritance to consider. Even if you are able to master a Grey Hunter's soul and not let its urges rule you, there is no guarantee that your children will be similarly strong-willed, especially since they'll have those urges from the day they are born. I'd strongly recommend against that course of action. As for making it your familiar, keep in mind that it takes a long time for the soul link to mature and that you need to be close to it the whole time. There is no guarantee that the creature won't kill you during the process. And if you do manage to slave it to your will, it could still be dangerous to everyone around you who is not protected by the soul bond. There was no need for a lecture. I was just joking, said Zorian flatly. Good. Even if its abilities would have been so very useful, Zorian said wistfully. Extreme toughness, speed and magical resistance. Yes, please. Just kill it, chop it up for parts and make an enhancement potion out of them, suggested Kale. You can ask Lukav to help you do it, I'm sure he'd jump at the chance. Not many people are crazy enough to go after one of those monsters, after all, so I'm pretty sure he never had a chance to work with Grey Hunter parts. You know, that actually sounds like an interesting idea. Glad I could help, Kale said, peering into a slowly bubbling metal pot on the table in front of him and scowling. Well, my current experiment is not going too well. And I thought I had it this time, too. Time to try batch number 4. He gave Zorian a speculative look. Say, do you think you can help me out here? Some of the steps are pretty simple, and observing my work will ensure you don't forget what I talked about as easily as you did last time. Yeah, I'll help, and holy gods will you stop reminding me of that. Zorian whined. It was more than a year, and I had a lot on my mind, it was natural I would forget a lot of things. Besides, I'm already working on sidestepping my faulty memory somehow. I wish you luck about that, Kale said. Nonetheless, we both know you'll remember my work a lot better if you understand what I'm doing instead of just blindly memorizing recipes and dry instructions. Think of this as free alchemical lessons. Well, he did use a fair amount of alchemy in solving the problems he encountered, so getting some advice in the field might actually be useful. All right. Where do you want me to start? The next day, Zorian decided to make good on his own internal promise to find some solution to the forgetting things problem. Well, he had to organize another one of Kyriel's magic lessons first, but there were no issues with that. Her progress was much faster than it had been in the previous restarts he had tried teaching her, since he had already been through this several times and was therefore getting better at motivating her and explaining the subject matter in a way she intuitively understood. His obligations done for the day, he quickly excused himself and went out for a walk, lest Kale or Amaya find some other job to dump in his lap. In the long run, Zorian knew he already had a perfectly good solution for remembering things with perfect clarity. He could just make memory packets like those of the Sciorian Matriarch, storing them in his mind for future recall. The map of Scioria's underworld that the Matriarch had left him was still as crystal clear in his mind as it had been the day he had assembled it from the scattered remnants left in the minds of the male survivors of the colony. It served as a shining example of what was possible for one who could master the procedure of creating such things. And it wasn't like learning how to do that would be an additional time sink. Either learning how to handle memory packets was something he was already working on. It was his current priority, in fact. The problem was, it would be a while before his effort there bore any fruit. Could be a couple of months, could be a couple of years, well, hopefully not years, since the Matriarch's memory package could decay into uselessness by then, but the point remained, it was not a quick solution to his immediate problem. Fortunately, human mages were quite good at making quick solutions to immediate problems, and surely some of them had at one point needed to memorize a map down to the very last detail, or recite a book word for word. Zorian would be shocked if the spell to do such a thing didn't already exist somewhere out there. It was just a question of whether he could find it. He decided to try at the Academy Library first. A bit unimaginative, but it was the best place to start his research, and it had been a while since he'd spent some time browsing its shelves. He kind of missed that during his long absence from Scioria. 3 hours later, he was torn between smiling in satisfaction and the urge to find something flammable to take his frustration out on. The bright side was, he found what he was looking for. There were no less than 5 different spells that could do what he wanted, mostly by allowing the caster to record what they see and hear for a brief period of time and storing that record in their minds. They differed in details, such as whether it was possible to pause the recording or not, but the core was the same. One even claimed it could form a clear memory retroactively, allowing the caster to remember what they had forgotten. The bad news was that these spells were only available in the restricted section of the library. Specifically, the mind magic section of it. Zorian leaned back in his chair, precariously balancing it on its back 2 legs and taking his glasses off to massage his eyes. To say that the Academy was reluctant to give permission to random students with regards to doing mind magic would be a severe understatement. He needed a better library pass if he wanted to get what he wanted, and there was no way he was going to get it through legal means. He narrowed his eyes while staring at the library ceiling. There was no helping it. He would just have to steal one. What has gotten my best student so gloomy on this fine day? Zorian jumped in his seat, startled, the poorly balanced chair almost giving up on him and pulling him to the floor. After finally stabilizing himself enough, he turned around to give Ilsa an unamused look. Sorry, she said, but her smile and the emotions he felt off of her told Zorian she was not sorry at all. I didn't think you would react so explosively. You just surprised me a bit, Zorian said. He had detected a person passing by him with his mind sense, but that wasn't exactly something unusual in this place. It wasn't like the library was empty, after all. What can I help you with, Miss Salady? Nothing, really. I am already done with what I came here for. You didn't notice it because you were so absorbed into your reading, but I had passed through this section twice before now. I just didn't want to interrupt you then, since you looked quite busy. I was just leaving now when I noticed you trying to burn a hole in the ceiling with your eyes, so I wondered if I can help you with whatever is troubling you. I appreciate the offer, Miss Salady, Zorian said. I really do. But I don't think you can help me with this. Helpful though she may be, Zorian was pretty sure that asking her to help him with committing a crime was a terrible idea. Amusing, but terrible. What are you working on, anyway? She asked, peering at the open book in front of him. Memory preservation spells. Why would you need that? I need a way to quickly and flawlessly memorize a notebook or two, Zorian said truthfully. Ilsa gave him a searching look. If this is about class work. No, I think I'm doing quite well in my classes, Zorian said, shaking his head. If anything, he thought he was doing too well. He was at the top of his class in terms of grades, despite his efforts to avoid standing out. It's personal. All I can say is that I'll be going on a trip soon, and I won't be able to bring anything with me. Anything but my memories, that is. And while my memory is quite good, it is not good enough to memorize, say, a word-for-word transcription of a book of potion recipes. Sounds ominous and suspicious, Ilsa noted. I'm not planning anything illegal, Zorian assured. I'm sure, Ilsa deadpanned. That's why you're looking up spells that I know you're not authorized to learn. Hence me being gloomy when you approached me, Zorian countered. I thought I had found a solution to my problem, but it turns out it's beyond my reach at the moment. I see, she said. Out of curiosity, how important is it that you be able to access the information in the book while it is stored inside your mind? I'm not sure I understand, Zorian frowned. What would be the point of holding a book in your head if you couldn't read it? To create a copy of it, of course, Ilsa smiled. It's a trick that some alteration experts use if they want to be able to create complex objects without carrying the originals with them. They use a spell to record the blueprint of an object, storing it inside their heads, then simply use that blueprint to create copies of the object whenever it strikes their fancy. Well, provided they have the correct raw materials. In your case, that would be a blank book of similar dimensions to what you're trying to copy and a bottle of ink. And you know how to do this? Asked Zorian hopefully. Ilsa hummed. Well, I am an alteration expert, but even if I was willing to teach you, this is not exactly an easy spell combination. It requires a great deal of alteration expertise and great shaping control. It would take dash. Zorian concentrated for a second and pulled at the heavy, metal-lined book on the shelf next to him with his magic, not bothering to make a single gesture or hand motion. The book smoothly slid out of its shelf and floated in front of Ilsa, startling her. Before she could say anything, the book opened itself and started turning its pages, slowly at first but then speeding up until the last half of it passed in a blur and the book slammed itself shut. His point made, Zorian smoothly slotted the book back to its previous place on the shelf. I can't think of a proper way to prove my alteration expertise right now, said Zorian in the resulting silence, but I'm perfectly capable of restructuring a metal pan into a fully functional metal watch. How much harder would this be compared to that? Not exactly harder, Ilsa admitted, still staring at the book on the shelf with a frown. But certainly different. You'd have to practice for a few days before you can get it right. She shook her head and tore her eyes away from the book to stare Zorian in the eyes. We're going to have a talk about this on Monday, Mr. Kaczynski. Does that mean you agree to teach it to me? He asked. Not yet. I'll need to run some tests on you to see whether you can handle the spells safely. Ilsa soon left, leaving Zorian alone to his own thoughts. He closed the book in front of him, setting it aside. Ilsa's spell combination wasn't exactly what he had been looking for when he searched for a quick and dirty solution, but it could work. In fact, it was even better than his original idea in some regards. Much less annoying to use, for instance. Plus, he wouldn't need to painstakingly transcribe the information from his head every time he wanted to add or change something. He would give Ilsa's method a chance. But he was going to steal a better library pass anyway. 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Most of it was routine, like him accompanying Taven and her team to the dungeon, teaching Curiel or helping Kale with his alchemy, and having his soul occasionally scanned by the other boy, with little results thus far. It helped that Curiel actually had a friend her age this time, so she monopolized his time a lot less. Whatever dark secret her mother harbored, Zorian had to admit Notchka's presence made Curiel a lot more manageable than she usually was, so he was definitely going to visit that bridge in future restarts as well. 2 main things stood out from the rest. The first one was that he had managed to learn the spells Ilsa had talked about, and they worked just as she said they would. He was happy that he could finally keep written notes on what happened in the time loop, since he now had a method of effectively transferring his notebooks into the next restart. Kale was happy too, since he could now be much more liberal about the amount of information he was sending over to his future self, he promptly gave Zorian 4 fully filled out notebooks to store the blueprints of, with a promise of 1 more by the end of the restart. Zorian really hoped Kale wouldn't accumulate notebooks so rapidly in future restarts, because Zorian could only hold about 15 blueprints in his mind. The Matriarch's memory packet didn't leave much room for anything else, really. The second interesting thing was that he had all but confirmed that Svim had his mind shielded at all times. He had barged into the man's office 3 different times, and the shield had always been active. Sadly, his unannounced visits seemed to have finally provoked the unflappable man somewhat, so now Zorian had 5 different shaping books on his reading list for their next session. Depending on which book Svim decided to focus on, their next lesson would consist of Zorian making detailed shapes out of sand, telekinetically dismantling a watch without breaking any of its parts, playing around with candles and matches, trying to apply paint on canvas without using any brushes, or carving glyphs into stones with his fingers. Or maybe all 5 if Svim was feeling particularly vindictive. But that was all background activity. The real focus of his efforts was tracking the Abasins and the cult of the World Dragon, mapping the structure of their organization. Originally he wanted to be cautious, spending most of the restart just observing everything, identifying their members and locations they met and did business in, but well, he saw his chance and he took it. While the Abasins were mostly full-blown mages and lived deep underground in heavily warded bases crawling with guards, only periodically visiting the surface, most of their allies in the city were far more modestly protected. Zorian followed around cultists and simple mercenaries that worked with the Abasins, tracking them down to their homes and reading their thoughts as they skulked around. The wards on their houses, if they even had them, were hilariously easy to avoid or break, allowing Zorian to root through their stuff for additional clues and connections with other members of their conspiracy. He had found out some interesting things. For instance, not all of the Abasin agents in the city were aware of what they were getting themselves into. The various merchants that smuggled food and other supplies to the invaders seemed entirely ignorant of whom they were really supporting. It was just business to them. Apparently there were numerous secret bases and operations happening in the deep reaches of Sioria's dungeon, and most of them were fairly inoffensive illegal harvesting operations for dangerous substances, secret research facilities by various trading groups, even a government black site of some sort. The merchants thought they were simply supplying one of these many shadowy factions and never pried much into the identity of their customers. A couple of mercenaries knew that the invaders planned to do some kind of terrorist strike during the summer festival, but didn't care about the details so long as they got paid. They didn't seem to be aware of the true scale of the invasion. Then there was the cult of the World Dragon, who honestly baffled him. The cult had a very complex, confusing structure, with lots of different ranks and categories of membership, and every rank seemed to have been fed a different story. On top of that, some members seemed to be in it purely for the benefits and had never bought into the cult's belief system in the first place. They were in it for the money apparently. Being a member of the cult of Dragon could be pretty profitable if you played your cards right. They knew that the cult planned to release a primordial at the summer festival to ravage the city and everything around it, of course, but didn't believe the primordial in question even existed, so no harm in going along with it, right? Right. There was still no evidence that Red Robe was in any way operating among the invasion forces, nor that he had shared even a speck of knowledge with them before running off to do something else, so Zorian decided to be a little more aggressive and start actually practicing his memory reading on acceptable targets. To that end, he identified a small cultist gathering organized by a trio of magic-wielding members who appeared to be of a slightly higher rank than the usual dregs Zorian encountered thus far and prepared to subdue them for questioning. 8 armed cultists, 3 of whom were magic wielders. His old self would have called him crazy for trying to tackle them all on his lonesome, even from ambush, but they never really stood a chance. He trapped the house they were to meet in before they even got there, having found out about their chosen meeting place several days in advance, and took them down one by one as they came. Mostly by telepathically compelling them into falling asleep, much like the Urania had tried to do to him such a long time ago when he'd first encountered them. The last arrival was a mage who had a mind shield spell formula on a ring and fought his attempt off. Zorian was forced to deal with him via slamming him into a wall a couple of times with some judicious application of the Force Blast spell. Once they were all down and tied up, Zorian took a deep breath and concentrated on diving into the memories of his first victim. Before he got instruction from the Yellow Cavern Guardians, Zorian sort of expected that probing someone's memories would be like one sometimes sees in adventure novels and the like, a walk through some psychedelic mindscape, where the intruder has to navigate deeply symbolical mazes and fight mental representations of the victim's psyche and whatnot. The reality was nothing like that. Or at least the way Arania did it was nothing like that, and the Yellow Cavern Guardians had seemed more than a little amused when Zorian had described the idea to them. Instead, memory probes simply consisted of a powerful telepathic probe that punched through the surface layers of the victim's mind and then started branching throughout their inner self in search of whatever the psychic was after. It was by its very nature a dangerous procedure. Unlike lighter, surface manipulations, deep scans like the one he was about to do could permanently ruin a mind. An amateur like Zorian was all but guaranteed to cause irreparable damage on his first try, unless they had spent years doing careful exercises which Zorian had no time for. Thus, he was not terribly surprised when that first man ended up as a mindless husk 5 minutes later. The convulsions and foaming at the mouth that preceded it were very disturbing, however, and almost made him give up on the whole thing right then and there. He didn't even manage to read anything out of his memories, so his death had been for nothing. A few minutes later, after he'd had some time to calm down and drown out the little voice in his head telling him he was a monster for killing a defenseless man like that, he continued with victim number 2. He decided not to stay so long inside the minds of the rest of them. Number 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 survived his probes. They could even wake up someday. Well, they could have, if the time loop wasn't so close to its end. The 6th attempt actually yielded some results. Too, he didn't find much in the man's memories before he had to withdraw, but he did add a few more names to his list to investigate, so at least some good came out of it. The last 2 suffered only light damage due to his probe. They knew nothing useful that could help him. Zorian left the house feeling hollow, wondering whether he was really justified in doing this. He came home to find Kyrielle in tears and the entire household in an uproar. Ray and Saw Satchel had been found dead in their home, brutally murdered by what appeared to be a monster missed by the many extermination squads operating in the city by now. Of their daughter, there was no trace.